In 1865, a French surgeon named Paul Broca received a package from the Dordogne region in southwestern France. Inside was a skull. Not unusual on its face, Broca was an anatomist. He received skulls. But this one was different, and when he turned it over in his hands, he stopped. There was a hole in it. Not a fracture, not the ragged entry wound of a weapon. A clean hole, roughly circular, about 3 centimeters across, cut through the bone with unmistakable precision. The edges were smooth, beveled, and around the rim of the hole, the bone had begun to regrow. Whoever this was, they had survived. Broca's hands were shaking slightly, by some accounts, though given that he was a 19th century Frenchman writing about his own brain research, we should take the drama with appropriate salt. But his conclusion was solid, and it changed everything. This skull was approximately 7,000 years old. Someone, 7 millennia before the invention of antibiotics, before the germ theory of disease, before any formal medical school had ever opened its doors, had deliberately cut a hole in another person's skull. And that person had lived, had healed, had walked around afterward with a neat circle of missing bone in their head, bone cells slowly bridging the gap, and presumably told no one exactly what had happened to them. That skull is the first chapter of this story, not the Hippocratic Oath, not the Edwin Smith Papyrus, not Galen or Vesalius or Pasteur. A hole in a skull, cut by an unnamed hand, in a world so ancient it barely registers as history at all. This is the story of medicine before doctors, before the profession, before the theory, before the word. It begins, as all the best things do, in the dark. We tend to think of medicine as something humans invented, a set of ideas formalized at some identifiable moment in history, maybe in Greece, maybe in Egypt, depending on which textbook you were handed at school. A moment when someone sat down, thought carefully, and decided that illness had causes, and causes had cures. But that's not how it started. It started the same way almost everything started, with pain. Watch a dog lick a wound. Watch a chimpanzee seek out specific leaves to self-medicate intestinal parasites, something primatologist Michael Huffman documented in the 1980s, observing chimps in the Mahale Mountains of Tanzania selecting the bitter pith of Vernonia amygdalina specifically when they were sick, a plant that contains steroidal compounds active against parasites. Watch an elephant travel kilometers out of her way to eat a particular soil clay that reduces stomach acidity. The impulse to treat injury and illness is not uniquely human. It is ancient, in a way that predates our species entirely. What is uniquely human, or at least nearly so, is the transmission of that knowledge. The decision to not just act on instinct, but to remember, to teach, to build. The oldest compelling evidence of deliberate medical care in the human record sits in a cave in Iraq. Shanidar Cave in the Zagros Mountains, excavated in the late 1950s by archaeologist Ralph Selecki. Among the bones he found there, Neanderthal bones 60,000 years old, was one particularly interesting burial. The soil around the skeleton contained a remarkable concentration of pollen from flowers, specifically yarrow, groundsel, grape hyacinth, joint pine, hollyhock. Flowers that don't grow in caves, flowers that had been placed there, in a pattern, around a body. Flowers, and here's the part that caught the world's attention, that are medicinal. Yarrow has been used as an astringent and anti-inflammatory in folk medicine across dozens of cultures. Groundsel has analgesic properties. Joint pine, the plant genus Ephedra, contains ephedrine, a compound still used today. Now, a word of caution. The Shanidar flower burial has been contested for decades. Some paleoanthropologists argue the pollen concentration might have been caused by a burrowing rodent, a flower-carrying gerbil effectively, or by contamination from later human activity in the same cave. The debate is ongoing. But here's what's not contested: the individual in that burial. Shanidar I, as he's cataloged, an adult male Neanderthal, estimated to have lived to his early 40s in a time when reaching 30 was an achievement, had survived extraordinary injury before his death. His right arm was withered and had likely been amputated above the elbow during his lifetime. He had healed fractures across his skull and face. He had severe arthritis. He was almost certainly blind in one eye. He had survived, for years, maybe decades. In an environment where survival depended on physical capability, this man, who could not have hunted effectively, who may have been unable to contribute to basic camp tasks, had been kept alive by his community, fed, protected, cared for. You can call that evidence of healing behavior, or you can call it evidence of empathy. In medicine, for most of human history, those two things were the same. Fire changes everything. We sometimes list fire as a technological achievement, which it is. We sometimes list it as a culinary revolution, which it also is. Cooking food dramatically increases caloric availability and is one of the likely drivers of the brain expansion that makes us, us. But fire is also medical technology. Fire sterilizes. Not because early humans understood the germ theory of disease, they had no such concept, but because they discovered empirically that wounds treated with heated tools or covered with ash healed better than wounds left alone. That water boiled over flame made people less sick than water drunk straight from a river. That warmth accelerated recovery from injury. The Neolithic period, roughly 10,000 to 3000 BCE, is where the archaeological record of medicine becomes more specific, more readable. We're past purely inferential territory now. Burial sites across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia contain skeletal evidence of healed fractures set with apparent splinting, skulls with teeth cleanly extracted, the bone healed afterward, infected teeth with deliberate drilled access holes, dental care in recognizable form 9,000 years ago. A 6,500-year-old jawbone found in Slovenia in the 1980s, examined with modern analytical techniques, revealed a tooth cavity treated with beeswax, still present, still adhered to the cavity walls after 65 centuries. These weren't accidents. These were interventions. Someone looked at pain, recognized it as a problem with a potential solution, and acted. That is medicine, in its first, purest form, the recognition that suffering can sometimes be addressed. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you lived in a world before written language, before organized religion as we now recognize it, before cities or states or any of the institutional structures that define modern life, and someone in your community fell badly ill, what would you do? You would do what humans have always done in the face of the genuinely unknown. You would reach for meaning. The first medical professionals were not physiologists, they were meaning makers. We call them shamans, a word borrowed from the Tungusic language of Siberia, shaman, referring to a specific type of spiritual intermediary. The term has been applied so broadly to so many different cultures across history that it risks losing precision entirely. What we're really pointing at is a role, the person in a community who mediates between the visible world of the living and the invisible world of spirits, ancestors, and forces beyond ordinary perception. This person also, typically, healed the sick. For a long time, the standard narrative of medical history treated shamanism as a superstitious predecessor to real medicine, the embarrassing childhood of a field that eventually grew up into science. We know better now, or we should. The anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss wrote one of the most quietly revolutionary papers in the study of healing in 1949. It was called The Effectiveness of Symbols, and its central argument was both simple and unsettling. Ritual healing works. Not in the mystical sense, not because spirits intervene, but because the human body is not a machine that processes biological inputs in isolation. It is a system profoundly entangled with belief, meaning, social context, and expectation. The shaman's performance of healing, the chanting, the herbs, the drama, the social witness of the community gathered around the sick person, activates real physiological responses. Endorphin release, reduced stress hormones, immune modulation. This is not metaphor. It is measurable, documented, peer-reviewed biology. The placebo effect, which we will examine in detail in a later episode, is the modern medical system's somewhat uncomfortable acknowledgement of this truth. A sugar pill can lower blood pressure. A fake surgery can reduce knee pain as effectively as a real one, in clinical trials published in the New England Journal of Medicine. The act of being treated, of being seen as ill and attended to, of being embedded in a ritual of care. These things have biological consequences independent of the specific chemical or mechanical intervention involved. The shaman knew this, not theoretically, practically, empirically, over generations of observation. What the shaman also knew was pharmacology. Every shamanistic healing tradition across every documented culture on Earth involves plants. The overlap between the ethnobotanical knowledge of traditional healers and the active compounds identified by modern pharmacology is not small. It is extensive. Willow bark, used across dozens of independent cultures from Europe to the Americas to East Asia as a fever reducer and pain reliever, contains salicin, which the body converts to salicylic acid, which is the active compound in aspirin. The foxglove plant, Digitalis purpurea, used in Welsh folk medicine for centuries to treat what healers called dropsy, the swelling associated with heart failure. Digitalis glycosides extracted from foxglove are still the basis of digoxin, one of the most commonly prescribed cardiac medications on the planet. Artemisia annua, sweet wormwood, used in Chinese traditional medicine for over 2,000 years for intermittent fevers. The artemisinin extracted from it is now the frontline treatment for malaria. Tu Yoyo won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2015 for this discovery, a discovery that started with a 4th century BCE Chinese text. The point is not that traditional medicine was the same as modern medicine. It wasn't. The theoretical frameworks were entirely different. The mechanisms were, almost universally, wrong. Disease attributed to spiritual imbalance, broken taboos, the malicious intent of enemies, supernatural forces. The point is that the empirical database, the accumulated observation of generations of healers watching what happened when they gave people certain plants, or performed certain procedures, or conducted certain rituals, was sophisticated, detailed, and in many cases, correct. The mechanism was wrong. The outcome was sometimes right. And in medicine, as in much of life, outcomes are what people remember. In 1991, 2 hikers in the Alps on the border of Austria and Italy found a body. They thought it was a recent death, a climbing accident maybe. They were wrong by about 5,300 years. Ötzi the Iceman, as he came to be known, is one of the most studied individuals in the history of science. The cold had preserved him with extraordinary completeness. Skin, organs, stomach contents, clothing, and critically for our purposes, equipment. In a small pouch attached to his gear, researchers found 2 pieces of a bracket fungus, Piptoporus betulinus, birch polypore, threaded onto leather strips. This fungus contains agaric acid, which has antibiotic properties against the type of intestinal parasites found in Ötzi's gut at autopsy. It also contains compounds active against mycobacteria. He was, in all probability, using it medicinally. He was also carrying Pteridium aquilinum, bracken fern, in his colon. Bracken has antiparasitic properties. He was, at the time of his death, apparently treating himself for an intestinal infection. Ötzi's medicine kit is the oldest we've ever found, but it's not an anomaly. It's a data point in a pattern that appears, with remarkable consistency, across nearly every prehistoric and early historic culture we've ever studied. Humans were pharmacologists before they were anything else medical. The question of how they figured it out is genuinely fascinating, and there are 2 competing theories. The first is the trial and error model. Humans, foraging widely and under frequent pressure of illness and injury, experimented, sometimes catastrophically, with plants in their environment and remembered what worked and what killed you. This is plausible. It is slow. It does not require any sophisticated conceptual framework, just accumulated observation over generations. The second theory is more interesting and more contested. The ethnobotanist Gordon Wasson, the anthropologist Jeremy Narby, and more recently the scholar Andrew Weil have each argued, in different ways with different levels of scholarly rigor, that altered states of consciousness played a central role in early pharmacological discovery. The argument goes like this. Certain plants that humans discovered and use medically are not obvious candidates for experimentation. They are not common food plants. They are sometimes toxic in all but very specific preparations. Their medical use is not straightforwardly derivable from observation of animal behavior, but they are, in many cases, psychoactive. And in shamanic healing traditions around the world, the discovery of medicinal plants is often attributed, mythologically, to visions received in altered states, to the plants themselves telling the healer their uses. This sounds mystical. It may not be entirely so. There is documented evidence that psychedelic states can produce extremely detailed sensory and conceptual associations between plants, chemicals, and bodily states, what some researchers call synesthetic pharmacognosy. It is not impossible that the ritual use of psychoactive plants created a feedback loop in which altered perception enhanced pattern recognition in plant medicine associations. We don't need to fully accept this theory to find it useful. What it points to is the same thing the whole of prehistoric medicine points to, that healing, in its original form, was not separate from the full spectrum of human experience: spiritual, psychological, social, physical. It was all of these things at once. The Neolithic pharmacist was also the community's priest, psychologist, and emergency surgeon. Which brings us to the procedure that makes every medical historian simultaneously impressed and slightly nauseated. Take a moment to fully register what we are about to discuss. Before antibiotics, before anesthesia, before any understanding of infection, nerve function, or intracranial pressure, in a world where the medical understanding of the brain was essentially zero, people drilled holes in other people's skulls, and those people survived. Trepanation, from the Greek trepannon, meaning borer, is the oldest surgical procedure in the human record with sufficient evidence to be unambiguous. It appears on every inhabited continent except Antarctica. The oldest confirmed cases are from the Neolithic period, roughly 6,500 to 7,000 years ago. The procedure continued in various forms into the medieval period and beyond, and in some traditional cultures was still being performed in the 20th century. The distribution is what breaks your brain, if you'll forgive the expression. Trepanned skulls have been found in Neolithic France, in pre-Columbian Peru and Bolivia, in ancient China, in Bronze Age Europe, in Neolithic Russia, in pre-contact North America. In some burial sites, particularly the Neolithic cemetery at Insisheim in France, the percentage of trepanned skulls among adults reaches 12%. Nearly 1 in 8 people in that community had the procedure. These are not isolated accidents. This was practiced medicine. The techniques varied by region and period. Scraping, using a sharp flint tool to grind progressively deeper into the skull until breakthrough. Boring, using a drill-like implement to make a series of small perforations around a circle, then lifting out the disc of bone. Cutting, using a fine blade to score straight lines in a square or rectangular pattern, then prying out the piece. Sawing. Each method leaves a characteristic signature in the bone that allows modern forensic anthropologists to identify the technique from thousands of years later. And what those forensic anthropologists find, consistently, is evidence of survival. In a 2018 study published in World Neurosurgery examining a large sample of trepanned skulls from Neolithic Europe and the Americas, researchers found that the majority showed signs of bone regrowth around the wound margins, unambiguous evidence that the patient had lived after the procedure. Some skulls showed multiple trepanations, with earlier holes fully healed and new ones at different locations. One Peruvian skull, from roughly 1000 CE, had 5 separate trepanations in various stages of healing. The survival rate, assessed across multiple studies, is estimated at roughly 60 to 80% in some populations, which is, to put it plainly, extraordinary for cranial surgery performed with stone tools. Why did they do it? This is the question that has occupied researchers for 150 years, and the honest answer is, we don't entirely know, and the answer almost certainly varied across cultures and periods. The most commonly offered explanation, consistent with the theoretical frameworks of prehistoric medicine, is that trepanation was performed to release spirits, demons, or other supernatural entities believed to be causing illness, epilepsy, severe headaches, madness, behavior changes. You drill a hole, the evil escapes, the patient recovers. This is probably part of it, but it may not be all of it. Physical trauma to the skull was common in prehistoric and early historic populations, from warfare, from accidents, from interpersonal violence. Epidural and subdural hematomas, bleeding between the skull and the brain, causing rapidly increasing intracranial pressure, are survivable if drained. They are fatal if not. An untreated epidural hematoma produces a characteristic clinical progression: initial loss of consciousness, a lucid interval of apparent recovery, then rapid neurological deterioration and death. A healer who had observed this pattern enough times might have discovered, empirically, that drilling into the skull at the site of impact, releasing the pressure, sometimes reversed the decline. They didn't have the words intracranial pressure, they didn't know what a hematoma was, but they knew what they had seen, and they acted on it. There is a skull in the collection of the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, one of Broca's finds, or from the same sites he excavated, that has been trepanned multiple times. The earliest hole is entirely healed, the bone fully bridged. The second is partially healed. The third shows minimal regrowth. This person had the procedure 3 times over what appears to be a span of years. They survived the first 2. The third, perhaps, was their last. We know nothing else about them. We don't know their name, their language, their beliefs, what happened in the days and weeks after each operation. We don't know if they were a community elder or a young warrior or an ordinary person who had exceptionally bad luck with head injuries. We know that someone operated on them 3 times, with care, with technique, with a set of skills accumulated over generations, and that twice, at minimum, it worked. Here's a problem with the way we teach medical history. We tend to draw a bright line between prehistoric medicine, the stuff we've been discussing, and the literate civilizations of the ancient world: Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, China, Greece. As if one day someone invented writing and medicine suddenly began. But the knowledge doesn't reset. It doesn't start over. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts we possess, written in Egypt around 1550 BCE, and almost certainly copying far older oral traditions, contains over 700 medical prescriptions using hundreds of plant compounds. Many of them overlap, in compounds and applications, with what we know of prehistoric herbal medicine from the archaeological record. The knowledge traveled forward. It was written down at last, but it didn't originate with the writing. The Rig Veda, the oldest of the Hindu scriptures, contains references to medical knowledge that predate the formal development of Ayurveda as a system by centuries. The Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine, which forms the basis of traditional Chinese medicine, is attributed to the legendary emperor Huangdi, but draws on accumulated medical knowledge stretching back millennia. What shifts with the literate civilizations is not the existence of medical knowledge. What shifts is its organization, its theoretical codification, and, critically, its social structure. Medicine becomes a profession. This is both a gain and a loss. The gain is real. Codification allows knowledge to be preserved, transmitted, refined, and built upon across generations and across geographical distances. You no longer have to personally apprentice with a healer to access their knowledge. It exists in a text. It can travel. The loss is subtler and worth noting. The earliest healers operated in a context of radical integration. Medicine, ritual, community, psychology, and ecology were a single fabric. The healer was embedded in the life of the people they served. They knew which plants grew where. They knew the psychological histories of their patients. They were present at births and deaths, at crises of meaning and crises of the body. As medicine professionalized, it progressively separated itself from most of these things, which gave it enormous power in certain domains: systematic observation, experimental rigor, pharmacological precision, and left it, increasingly, with no good answers for questions like, why does this person keep getting sick? Or, what does it mean to heal? Or, what is the connection between what a person believes and what their body does? Those questions, the early healers would have found strange, not because they were unanswerable, but because they would never have separated them in the first place. We are, in some ways, still finding our way back. There is a researcher at the University of New Mexico named Andrew Weil, now better known as an integrative medicine advocate than a pure scientist, but that's beside the immediate point, who said something that has stayed with me. He said, The history of medicine is largely the history of the placebo effect. He meant it critically, as a challenge to the profession's tendency to attribute all healing to specific interventions and ignore the role of the therapeutic relationship, of meaning, of expectation. But I think there's something else in it, something more generous. What the history of prehistoric medicine shows us is that humans, well before they had the conceptual tools to understand disease at a mechanistic level, were remarkably effective healers. Not always, not consistently, not by modern standards of evidence, but not by chance either. They were effective because they paid extraordinary attention, because they developed, over millennia, a detailed empirical database of what worked, because they understood intuitively, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say they had never forgotten, that healing is a fundamentally relational act, that a sick person is a whole person, body, mind, history, community, meaning. The hole in the Neolithic skull, the one Broca held in his hands in 1865, the bone regrowing around the edges, is not evidence of a primitive fumbling toward real medicine. It is evidence of a fully realized, culturally embedded, empirically grounded practice of care that was, by any reasonable measure, working. The unnamed person who picked up the stone tool and drilled that hole had been trained by someone, who had been trained by someone, who had been trained by someone, in a chain reaching back into a past so remote we can barely imagine it. They had a theory, probably involving spirits or cosmic forces or the will of gods we no longer name. Their theory was wrong, but their patient walked away. That gap between the wrong theory and the right outcome is, in many ways, the whole story of medicine. It is a story full of wrong theories, full of brilliant mistakes, brilliant accidents, brilliant stubbornness in the face of things that shouldn't work but do. Full of people who looked at pain and decided, against all odds, that it was their problem to solve. The first healer whose name we will never know, whose hands shaped a stone, whose patient healed, made that decision in a world of almost total darkness. They made it anyway. That's where we start. The man on the reed mat is dying. He came in from the eastern desert 3 days ago, carried by 2 younger men who barely spoke. His skull is fractured, a clean depression above the right ear, the kind you get when a stone wall falls and you weren't fast enough. The wound has begun to smell. His left arm doesn't move when you touch it. The physician crouches, looks, touches the man's skull with 2 fingers, holds them there a long time. Then he opens the wooden case he carries. It smells of resin and dried herb, and he begins to work. We don't know this physician's name. We don't know if he was young or old, slave or free, proud or frightened. We only know what he did, because someone, somewhere, wrote it down. The year is approximately 2650 BCE. We are in Memphis, the capital of the 3rd dynasty of Egypt. The Nile floods and retreats on its ancient schedule. The pyramids of Giza don't exist yet. Somewhere in this city, possibly in this very building complex, a man named Imhotep is alive. He is not yet a god. He has not yet been dead 2,000 years. He is a man, and he is busy. Imhotep holds a position that has no modern equivalent. He is the vizier, second only to the pharaoh Djoser, effectively the administrator of an empire. He is a scribe, which in Egypt means something closer to what we'd call a scholar. He is the architect of the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, the first large-scale stone monument in human history, which his engineers and laborers are currently in the process of building. And he is a physician, all at once, the same man. We have almost no direct writings from Imhotep himself. This is the first thing you have to understand about his story. We are working from shadows. What we know comes from inscriptions, from legends, from text written centuries after his death that reference him as a teacher, a sage, a healer. The ancient Egyptians kept lists of great men, and Imhotep appears on them the way Newton might appear on a list of great scientists. Not first, not controversial, just clearly there, clearly important, his presence requiring no explanation. He was born, probably, to a father named Kenneth, who was himself a builder or architect. He rose through court service. He earned titles that included the One Who Comes in Peace, Chief of Seers, Overseer of the King's Estate, and, significantly, Chief Physician of Upper and Lower Egypt. That last title was not ceremonial. In ancient Egypt, the physician was a specialist role, trained in dedicated institutions, paid from temple funds, and expected to produce results. Imhotep appears to have been not just a practicing physician, but the director of medicine, the figure who standardized, taught, and perhaps himself wrote down what Egyptian doctors knew. After his death, it took roughly 100 years for the deification process to begin. That's fast by ancient standards. Within 200 years, he had a cult. Within 500, he had dedicated temples. Within 1,000, the Greeks had encountered his legend and done what the Greeks always did. They absorbed him, renamed him, and called him their own. But before all of that, before the temples, before the cult, before the centuries of myth accumulating like sediment, there was the man, crouching over a fractured skull, touching it with 2 fingers, thinking. In 1862, an American antiquities dealer named Edwin Smith purchased a papyrus scroll from a merchant in Luxor, Egypt. He paid a modest sum. He could not have known what he was holding. The scroll was old, written, by carbon dating and paleographic analysis, somewhere around 1600 BCE. But the content it recorded was far older. The scribal hand, the language, the medical terminology, all point to source material from the Old Kingdom, the period of the 3rd and 4th dynasties, roughly 2600 to 2400 BCE, the period of Imhotep. What Edwin Smith held in his hands was a surgical textbook, written in ancient Egypt, 48 centuries ago. Let that sit for a moment, because the word textbook is not metaphor or flattery. The Edwin Smith papyrus is organized, clinical, systematic. It covers 48 cases in ascending order from head to toe, the universally recognized structure of a medical examination manual, which we still use today. Each case follows an identical format: the title, the examination, the diagnosis, the verdict, and the treatment. The examination sections read like this, and I'm translating loosely from the scholarly rendering. If you examine a man having a gaping wound in his head, penetrating to the bone, smashing his skull and rending open the brain of his skull, you should palpate his wound. Should you find that skull of his smashed, those ripples which form in copper when it is melted, something therein throbbing and fluttering under your fingers like the weak place of an infant's crown before it becomes whole. This is a clinical description of a brain contusion. The ripples in melted copper is a physician describing, in the only language available to him, the appearance of exposed brain tissue pulsing with the heartbeat. It is precise, it is accurate, and it appears in a document written when most of the ancient world was still in the Bronze Age. The word used in that passage, the Egyptian word for brain, appears here for the first time in recorded history. The Edwin Smith papyrus contains the first written use of the word brain in any human language. Not Greek, not Mesopotamian, Egyptian, 4,600 years ago. What else does it contain? Descriptions of suturing wounds with needle and thread, instructions for using raw meat as a wound poultice in the first day. We now know this works because raw meat contains compounds that reduce bacterial load and draw fluid. Descriptions of the pulse, understood as a diagnostic signal connected to the heart. The observation that spinal cord injuries result in loss of function in specific limbs, what we would call localization. The concept that the brain and spine control different parts of the body. This wasn't understood in Europe until the 17th century CE. The Egyptians observed it, wrote it down, and used it clinically in 2600 BCE. There are, in the papyrus, cases where the physician diagnoses the patient, then writes one of 3 verdicts: an ailment which I will treat, an ailment with which I will contend, an ailment not to be treated. The third verdict, do not treat, is not resignation. It is triage. It is a physician recognizing that intervention will cause more harm than restraint and making that clinical decision explicitly, out loud, recorded for teaching. This is a concept the Western medical tradition did not formalize until the 19th century. Edwin Smith purchased the papyrus in 1862. He spent years attempting to translate it, made some progress, but never completed the work. When he died, his daughter donated it to the New York Historical Society. It sat there, mostly forgotten, mostly unread. It was not until 1930, 68 years after its purchase, that the American Egyptologist James Henry Breasted published the first full scholarly translation, with commentary. The medical community was stunned. Doctors reviewing the text recognized colleagues across 4,600 years. The clinical logic was their clinical logic. The diagnostic structure was their diagnostic structure. The language was different, the instruments primitive, the anatomy sometimes wrong, but the thinking was the same. That's not metaphor either. That is the actual historical event. Modern physicians reading an ancient Egyptian medical text and recognizing themselves.
To understand what Egyptian physicians could actually do, you have to leave the papyrus for a moment and look at the bodies. Physical examination of ancient Egyptian remains, mummified tissue, skeletal analysis, CT scanning of mummies performed in the 21st century has confirmed what the texts describe. We have found mummies with healed skull fractures. We have found mummies with surgical incisions that show signs of post-operative healing, meaning the patient survived. We have found splinted, broken bones, set correctly and fused cleanly, suggesting both knowledge of bone alignment and effective immobilization technique. We have found a mummy with an artificial toe, a prosthetic carved from wood and leather attached to the foot of a woman who had lost her own. The toe shows wear patterns consistent with active use. She walked on it. Whoever made it understood biomechanics well enough to produce a functional prosthetic limb. This was New Kingdom Egypt, roughly 3,000 years ago. The operating instruments recovered from Egyptian medical sites include bronze scalpels, needles for suturing, forceps, hooks, and probes. Some of these are recognizable to any surgeon alive today. The morphology, the shape, of some instruments has barely changed in 4 millennia. There are reasons for that. Human anatomy hasn't changed, the problems haven't changed, and the Egyptians had already found good solutions. Egyptian medicine organized itself into specializations we would recognize. There were physicians who treated only eyes, physicians who treated only teeth, the first known dental practitioners in history, and Egyptian dental work has been confirmed by remains showing deliberate drilling and filling of teeth roughly 2000 BCE. There were physicians for internal complaints, physicians for wounds and external injuries, and physicians who combined medical practice with priestly function, attending to both physical and spiritual illness. The Edwin Smith Papyrus focuses almost entirely on trauma, wounds, fractures, dislocations. It is a surgical text, concerned with what happens when the body is broken from outside. But other papyri fill in the rest. The Ebers Papyrus, roughly contemporary, covers internal medicine, diet, herbs, infusions, treatments for conditions ranging from headache to what appears to be diabetes. It describes over 900 medicinal compounds. Some are clearly effective: honey as an antibacterial wound dressing, willow bark infusions for pain, castor oil as a purgative, aloe for burns. Some are not: crocodile fat as a baldness cure, mouse brain paste for toothache, dung poultices that would have introduced, not solved, infection. This is important to say. Egyptian medicine was not magic, but it was not wholly rational either. It operated in a space between the empirical and the supernatural that is genuinely difficult to parse from the outside. The physician who sutured a wound with needle and thread might also recite a spell over the thread as he worked. Were these two acts in conflict in the Egyptian mind? Probably not. One addressed the physical tear, one addressed the spiritual disruption that allowed injury to occur. They were parallel interventions, not competing ones. What the Edwin Smith Papyrus represents, what makes it so startling to modern readers, is the existence within this tradition of a voice that is almost purely clinical. A voice that examines, measures, records, and reasons without reference to the supernatural. In case after case, the diagnosis rests entirely on physical observation: the color of the skin, the warmth of the wound, the movement or stillness of the limbs, the quality of the pulse, the smell of the injury. This voice did not win. It coexisted with the magical tradition for centuries, then slowly lost ground as the culture shifted, as Alexandria rose and fell, as Rome reorganized Egyptian religion under its own template. But it existed. someone wrote it down. Someone taught it. Someone practiced it. That voice sounds, across the distance of 50 centuries, remarkably like us. We should be careful not to idealize this. The Egyptian physicians were brilliant within a very specific horizon. That horizon had edges, and the edges were real. The anatomy was partially wrong. The Egyptians had a concept called the metu, channels, something like a vascular system but more diffuse, that were understood to carry blood, air, water, semen, and even disease throughout the body. The heart was understood as the seat of consciousness and emotion, which we now know is the brain's function. The brain was considered less important. During mummification, it was typically removed through the nasal cavity and discarded. The internal organs went into canopic jars, carefully preserved. The brain went away. This error, this fundamental misunderstanding of neurological primacy, didn't prevent Egyptian physicians from correctly describing spinal injuries and their effects on motor function. They observed it correctly even though they understood it wrong. That tension, accurate observation, flawed theory, is something we should recognize. Science has always worked this way, including now. Then there is the harder problem. In the Edwin Smith papyrus, there are cases labeled not to be treated. Case 6, for instance, describes a compound fracture of the skull with exposed brain tissue, unconsciousness, and bleeding from both nostrils. The assessment is an ailment not to be treated. This is correct. In 2650 BCE, without antibiotics, without surgical anesthesia beyond alcohol or opium, without sterile technique, without blood transfusion, a wound of this severity was a death sentence. Opening the skull further to attempt repair would accelerate the patient's death. The decision not to treat was the decision that served the patient best. But the Egyptian physician didn't simply abandon these cases. The papyrus describes making the patient comfortable, providing liquid nourishment. The language suggests a practice of palliative care, keeping the dying comfortable, easing the process that is both humane and clinically deliberate. Still, there were things they could not do. They could not fight infection at the source. They had no concept of bacterial contamination. A wound that went septic was almost certainly fatal, regardless of how skillfully it had been sutured. We have mummies that show clear signs of post-operative sepsis, healed surgical incisions gone wrong downstream, the bone showing evidence of spreading infection. The physicians could observe the outcome. They could not prevent it. And here is a contradiction that the historical record holds without resolving. Egyptian medicine at its most empirical, as in the Edwin Smith papyrus, is strikingly rational. But Egyptian medicine in practice, in the temples and in the homes of ordinary people, ran on a parallel track of incantation and ritual that the physicians themselves participated in. The same doctor who palpated a skull fracture with careful, informed fingers also recited spells. The same tradition that produced the clinical voice of Edwin Smith also produced charm tablets meant to be dissolved in water and drunk for headaches. These are not separate medicine and superstition. They are one integrated system, and the separation we want to impose, the clean division between rational science and irrational magic, is a modern division that did not exist in the ancient Egyptian mind. What does that mean for how we think about Imhotep? For how we think about the tradition he represents? It means the story is complicated. It means genius and belief and fear and careful observation all lived together in the same rooms, the same practices, the same men, the way they always do.
Imhotep died, probably around 2600 BCE. And then the work of turning a man into a god began. The process was slow at first. 100 years after his death, he was being referenced in texts. 200 years after, there were stories. 500 years after, he was being invoked as a healer by name, physicians calling on him the way Greek physicians would later call on Apollo or Asclepius. 1,000 years after his death, the pharaoh Amenhotep III elevated him officially. Imhotep was now a god. Not a minor god, not a local deity remembered in one city, a major deity of the Egyptian pantheon, worshipped across the empire, the son of Ptah, the god of creation, and associated specifically with healing, wisdom, and medicine. What followed was the construction of the healing temples, the sanatoriums, the temples of Sekhmet, the Imhotep shrines at Memphis and at Philae. And these were not merely places of worship, they were functional medical institutions. Patients came from across Egypt and eventually from across the Mediterranean world. They arrived sick, wounded, barren, desperate. They bathed in the temple pools, they fasted, they prayed, they made offerings, and then they slept in the inner chambers of the temple, on mats laid out in designated rooms while the priests moved among them. This was the practice of incubation, sleeping in a sacred space to receive a healing dream or vision in which the god appears and provides diagnosis or treatment. It sounds from a modern vantage point like pure superstition, but look at what was actually happening inside those temples. The temple physicians were trained practitioners. The temple maintained herb gardens. Surgeries were performed in the temple complex. There are depictions on temple walls of surgical instruments, of patients in various states of treatment. The dream interpretation by the priests, while religious in framing, often resulted in dietary prescriptions, herbal treatments, and behavioral changes that were medically coherent. The spiritual framework was the vehicle, the medicine traveled inside it. This is the model that would influence the Asclepion, the healing temples of the Greek god Asclepius. And here the story gets politically complicated, because Asclepius and Imhotep are almost certainly the same figure. The timing is too precise to be coincidence. The Greeks made sustained contact with Egypt after Alexander the Great's conquest in 332 BCE. But Greek-Egyptian cultural exchange was happening centuries before that, through trade routes along the Mediterranean coast. By the time the Greek Asclepius cult was well developed, Egyptian physicians were already known throughout the ancient world as the best available. Greek scholars studied in Egyptian temples. Herodotus, visiting Egypt in the 5th century BCE, noted with visible admiration that Egyptian medicine was more advanced and more specialized than anything in Greece. What the Greeks did with what they found in Egypt is a model we would recognize from every era of colonialism and cultural appropriation thereafter. They took the knowledge, they absorbed the practice, they renamed the gods, and they attributed the origin to themselves. The Hippocratic tradition, the foundation of Western medicine, shows Egyptian influence throughout. The theory of diagnosis by systematic observation, the case study format, the concept of prognosis, the understanding of the pulse. All of these appear in Egyptian medical texts centuries before Hippocrates was born. Hippocrates himself, in the ancient accounts, is said to have studied in Egypt. We cannot verify this, but the intellectual debt is visible in the texts. And Imhotep, the actual man, the actual physician, the father of the tradition, was quietly set aside. His name became Asclepius, his temples became Greek temples, his story became a Greek myth. The Library of Alexandria held the largest collection of medical knowledge in the ancient world. Egyptian texts, Greek texts, texts from Persia and India and Mesopotamia, 500,000 scrolls at its peak. The healing traditions of 5,000 years of human civilization concentrated in one place. We know what happened to it, or rather, we know what we think happened, which is not quite the same thing. The library declined over centuries through a combination of fires, wars, Christian edicts against pagan learning, and Roman imperial indifference. By the 5th century CE, it was effectively gone. With it went the primary transmission route for Egyptian medical knowledge. The Romans had a complicated relationship with Egyptian medicine. On one hand, Roman emperors employed Egyptian physicians. The tradition was respected at the elite level. On the other hand, Rome's absorption of Egypt was never a cultural exchange of equals. Egypt became a province. Its religious practices were alternately tolerated and suppressed. Its intellectual traditions were filtered through the Roman educational system, which privileged Greek texts as the source of wisdom. The Roman physician Galen, who dominated Western medical thought from the 2nd century CE well into the Renaissance, worked almost entirely from Greek sources. His anatomy was better than the Greeks, but still significantly wrong, because Roman and Greek tradition prohibited the dissection of human corpses. Galen dissected animals, primarily Barbary macaques, and assumed the anatomy transferred. It didn't, not entirely. For 1,400 years, the European medical tradition operated on Galen's errors. Then Christianity reshaped what healing meant. Not entirely wrongly, Christian institutions preserved texts, built hospitals, cared for the sick when no one else would. The monastic tradition kept medicine alive in the early medieval period when it might otherwise have vanished entirely. But the Christian framing of disease as spiritual affliction, of healing as divine grace rather than empirical intervention, pushed the clinical tradition underground. Surgery in particular became associated with impurity. The church prohibited clergy from performing operations that involved bleeding. The surgeons, the cutters, became a separate, lower-status profession, eventually the barber surgeons, operating in the tradition of craft rather than learning. The Egyptian voice in the Edwin Smith papyrus, cool, observational, empirical, unafraid to say, "I cannot treat this," that voice went silent for more than 1,000 years.
Imagine a scroll in a jar. It has been wrapped in linen, sealed with a clay stopper, placed in a dry chamber somewhere in Upper Egypt. The air is still. The temperature barely varies. The papyrus is old, already old when it was placed here, and it is old now, in the way that only things from before history feel old, outside of time, suspended. Outside, centuries pass. The Persian conquest, Alexander, the Ptolemies, Rome, Constantinople, the Arab conquest, the Crusades, the Ottoman Empire, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1799, which sparked the modern world's fascination with antiquity and eventually led to the decipherment of hieroglyphics in 1822. The scroll waits. Sometime in the early 19th century, the scroll enters the antiquities market. These markets existed wherever archaeology intersected with poverty and colonial extraction. Local Egyptians digging up their own ancestors' possessions and selling them to wealthy Europeans and Americans for whom these objects were curiosities. The ethical dimensions of this were not invisible at the time. They were simply not prioritized. Edwin Smith was an American who lived for many years in Egypt. He was an adventurer, a dealer, a man who moved in the circles of early Egyptology when Egyptology was barely a discipline. In 1862, he acquired the papyrus. He could read hieratic script, the cursive form of hieroglyphics used for everyday writing, well enough to know he had something unusual. What he had was 4.68 meters of papyrus, covered on both sides. The front, the surgical treatise. The back, a collection of spells and remedies, a different voice entirely, possibly added by a later scribe who found blank space and used it. Smith worked on the translation for years. He never published. He kept the scroll. When he died in 1906, 44 years after acquiring it, his daughter gave it to the New York Historical Society, where it stayed until the Egyptian government requested its return in 2006. It now resides in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. James Henry Breasted published the full translation in 1930. The medical world read it. Then, slowly, it began to filter into the standard account of medical history, the account of where modern medicine comes from, who figured out that observation and diagnosis and systematic treatment work. But here is the problem. The account remained incomplete. The Egyptian contribution was acknowledged, then often footnoted. The father of medicine in Western tradition remained Hippocrates, a Greek born in 460 BCE, working 2,000 years after the tradition we've been tracing. The standard medical history texts used in schools and universities give Egypt a paragraph, sometimes a page. Hippocrates gets a chapter. This is not an accident. It is an accumulation of choices made by people who found the Greek origin story more coherent with other things they believed, and who did not feel the same urgency to revise it that a complete reading of the evidence demanded. The man on the reed mat did not know he was making history. He came in injured, was treated with the tools and knowledge available, lived or died. His physician crouched over him with 2 careful fingers and thought. That thinking was the beginning of something, not medicine itself, which is as old as pain, but recorded medicine, the attempt to capture what works, to write it down, to give it to the next physician and the one after that. That impulse, give it to the next one, is the oldest intellectual gesture of which we have evidence. Before philosophy, before theology as an organized system, before written history, someone in Egypt looked at a body and thought, I should write this down so someone else can learn from it.
And they did. And it was nearly lost. And it was nearly forgotten. And it survived. Imhotep is a strange figure to hold in mind because he is simultaneously too much and too little. Too much because by the time the myth-making was done, he had become a god, his story absorbed into divine narrative, the human details blurred into symbol. Too little because the actual man, the physician who worked in the 3rd Dynasty court, who perhaps taught the clinical method we see in the Edwin Smith papyrus, who trained students and made decisions about how to record and categorize disease, that man is almost completely invisible to us. We have his name, we have his titles, we have his architectural achievement. The step pyramid still stands at Saqqara, the oldest large stone structure on Earth, still visible, still staggering. We have the tradition that claims him as its origin, though we cannot trace every link in that chain. And we have a voice in a papyrus. Whether that voice is literally his, or belongs to a student of his, or belongs to a tradition he shaped, we cannot say with certainty, but the voice is there. Careful, measured, unafraid.
There is something in the third verdict, an ailment not to be treated, that keeps coming back. Because it is an act of honesty that medicine has always found difficult. It says, I know what I can do and what I cannot do. It says, the most helpful thing I can offer you right now is not intervention. It says, I see you clearly enough to know that my action would be a vanity, not a service. That takes more knowledge, not less. It takes more courage, not less. And someone in Egypt, in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, understood this and wrote it down in a format designed to teach it to the next generation. The world buried that understanding for 1,000 years. Then the scroll came out of the ground, and a man who couldn't quite translate it bought it anyway, because he knew it mattered. And 68 years later, when the full translation arrived, doctors recognized themselves across the distance of 4,600 years. That recognition, that shock of familiarity, is not just a medical event. It is a philosophical one. It tells us something about what we are and what we've always been. Creatures who look at the broken thing, touch it with careful fingers, and try to understand what's wrong. We have been doing this for as long as we have been writing, possibly longer. Imhotep became a god because the ancient world could not hold the idea that a man might simply have been this wise. That a mortal might look at a fractured skull and know, really know, what it meant, what could be done and what couldn't. We don't need him to have been a god. The human story is more interesting than the divine one. It is the story of a man who paid close attention and wrote it down and gave it to the next one. And here we are, still doing the same thing.
Picture an island, not a postcard island, not the blue and white tourist Greece of the 21st century, something older, rawer. The island of Kos in the eastern Aegean, around 400 BCE. The hillsides smell of thyme and salt. There are olive trees so gnarled they look like they remember things. There is a temple to Asclepius, the god of medicine, where the sick come to sleep on stone floors and wait for divine dreams to heal them. And somewhere on this island, according to tradition, there is a man. He is not praying, he is watching. He watches a patient breathe. He watches the color of their skin shift from pink to gray. He watches how a fever climbs through the afternoon and breaks at dawn. He writes things down, not spells, not prayers, not the names of gods, observations, patterns, the body behaving according to rules that have nothing to do with the divine. His name is Hippocrates, and almost everything you think you know about him is probably wrong. Every doctor in the Western world has, at some point, encountered his name. Medical schools still invoke it. Hospitals frame his words on their walls. There is a bust, the famous one, the bearded philosopher face, reproduced in marble foyers and textbook covers from London to Lagos to Los Angeles. And then there is the oath. You know the line everyone misquotes. First, do no harm. That one. Doctors cite it in ethics debates. It is used in legal arguments. It is the moral bedrock of medicine as a profession. Except, Hippocrates never said it. That exact phrase, primum non nocere, does not appear in the Hippocratic Oath as it was written. It appears in a different, later text. The oath itself says something more nuanced,
more political, and in some ways far more interesting than the sanitized version most people know. Here's what the oath actually opens with. I swear by Apollo the physician, and Asclepius, and Hygeia, and Panacea, and all the gods and goddesses, that, according to my ability and judgment, I will keep this oath and this contract. Wait, a rational, observation-based, proto-scientific medical tradition, swearing by the gods? That's the first contradiction. It won't be the last. The problem with Hippocrates, and it is a problem that historians have been quietly screaming about for over a century, is that we cannot find him. Not the myth. The myth is everywhere. The man is almost nowhere. Let me give you the facts, cleanly, without the mythology. Hippocrates of Kos was born approximately 460 BCE and died approximately 370 BCE. That is a 90-year life, already suspicious in an era when most people died before 50. He lived during one of the most intellectually extraordinary centuries in human history, the age of Socrates, Plato, Pericles, and the Parthenon. Athens was at its height. Ideas were moving fast across the Greek world. He was, according to ancient sources, a member of the Asclepiads, a guild, possibly a family clan, of physicians centered on Kos who traced their lineage directly to Asclepius, the god of medicine. He trained students, he traveled, to Thessaly, perhaps to Thrace, possibly to the Persian court, though that last one is almost certainly legend. Two ancient sources mention him by name with any real substance: Plato in the Phaedrus, where Hippocrates is cited as a great physician, and Aristotle, who refers to him as the Great Hippocrates. Both references are brief. Both tell us almost nothing about what he actually taught or practiced. And then there is the Hippocratic corpus. The corpus is a collection of approximately 60 texts, medical treatises, clinical observations, dietary advice, surgical instructions, ethical prescriptions. They were collected in Alexandria around the 3rd century BCE, bound together under his name and handed down through history as his life's work. Here is the problem. They contradict each other, not in minor ways, in fundamental ways. Different texts in the corpus advocate for completely opposite theories of disease. Different texts are written in different styles, some dense and technical, some almost lyrical. Some are attributed to specific authors, most are not. Scholars have spent 2.5 millennia arguing about which texts, if any, Hippocrates actually wrote. The current consensus, to the extent there is one, is that the corpus represents a tradition, a school of thought, a community of physicians working across perhaps a century or more, whose work was gradually consolidated under a single famous name. This is not unusual in antiquity. Homer may have been multiple poets. The texts of the Old Testament were written by multiple hands across multiple centuries. Ancient cultures thought differently about authorship than we do. The name was not just a credit, it was a brand, a tradition, an authority. But what it means for us is this. When we say Hippocrates believed, we are almost always on shaky ground. The man behind the myth is not a fraud. He almost certainly existed. He was almost certainly a gifted physician and teacher whose reputation was real and whose influence in his own lifetime was considerable. But the towering figure of medical history, the father of medicine, the rational revolutionary who single-handedly dragged healing out of superstition, that figure is at least partly a construction, a story medicine told itself about its own origins. The question is, why did medicine need that story? To understand what Hippocrates, or the tradition that bears his name, actually changed, you have to understand what medicine looked like before. Not what you think, not what is usually described as primitive, as though ancient people were simply stupid. Ancient medicine was sophisticated. It was systematic. It had institutions, practitioners, texts, and a coherent theoretical framework. It just operated on completely different assumptions about what caused disease, and therefore about what could cure it. In Greece, the dominant model was divine causation. Illness was the work of gods, or demons, or the violation of sacred laws. Plague descended from Apollo's arrows, as Homer shows us in the opening of the Iliad. Madness was divine possession. Epilepsy, which the Greeks called the sacred disease, was the seizure of the body by supernatural forces.
The locus of medicine was the temple, specifically the temples of Asclepius, which were called Asclepieia, and which functioned as a combination of hospital, shrine, and therapeutic resort. Patients would travel long distances to sleep on the temple floor in a practice called incubation, ritual sleep in sacred space, during which the god Asclepius would appear in a dream and either heal them directly or prescribe a cure. This was not theater. This was not the equivalent of going to a witch doctor. The Asclepieia at Epidaurus, at Pergamon, at Kos, these were real institutions with real staff, real records, and what appears to have been a genuine therapeutic function. The combination of travel, rest, clean water, sunlight, and psychological reassurance was almost certainly beneficial for many conditions. The placebo effect is real and powerful. The Asclepieia understood something about it, even if they had no language for it. But the framework was divine. The cause of illness was divine. The cure was divine. The physician was, at best, a translator between the mortal and the sacred. Into this world comes a different idea. Not a new idea exactly. There were rational medical thinkers before the Hippocratic tradition. The Egyptians, as we saw in the last episode, had been practicing empirical medicine for millennia. Alcmaeon of Croton, in the late 6th century BCE, was performing dissections and theorizing about health as a balance of bodily forces. The Pythagoreans had medical ideas. The pre-Socratic philosophers were already arguing that the cosmos operated according to natural laws rather than divine whims. But what the Hippocratic tradition did, and this is real, this is documented, this genuinely happened, was bring this naturalistic thinking into systematic clinical practice and insist, loudly and explicitly, that it was the only legitimate basis for medicine. The text called On the Sacred Disease, one of the more confidently attributed texts of the corpus, though even that is not certain, opens with a declaration that would have been genuinely radical in its time. It was written that epilepsy is not sacred, not divine, but has a natural cause like other diseases, and that those who first called it sacred were the kind of people who cover their ignorance with piety. That is a direct attack on the temple physicians, on the entire framework of divine causation. It is saying, there is no sacred disease, there is only disease, and the people telling you otherwise are using religion to hide the fact that they don't understand what they're doing. That is not the language of a gentle reformer. That is a polemical statement, a challenge. Whether Hippocrates himself wrote it doesn't matter. Someone in his tradition did, and the tradition that would bear his name was built on that challenge. Now we come to the part of the story that medicine spent a very long time not wanting to talk about. Because the Great Rational Revolution, the insistence on natural causes, clinical observation, empirical evidence, was built on a theory of disease that was almost entirely wrong. The theory of the four humors. Here's the system as codified in the Hippocratic tradition, and later elaborated by Galen into a near-religious orthodoxy. The human body contains four fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These humors correspond to the four elements: air, water, fire, and earth, into four qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry. Health is the state in which the four humors are in proper balance. Disease is imbalance, too much of one humor or too little of another, or a humor corrupted and turned against its natural state. The elegance of this system cannot be dismissed. That is part of what makes it interesting and part of why it survived for so long. It explained almost everything. Seasonal illness? Different seasons favor different humors. Some people get sicker in winter, excess phlegm, cold and wet. Some people run hot and choleric, excess yellow bile. Old people become cold and dry, black bile predominates. The theory was flexible, internally consistent, and capable of absorbing new observations without collapsing. It also gave medicine a therapeutic framework. If disease is imbalance, the cure is rebalancing. You purge the excess humor through bleeding, through induced vomiting, through laxatives, through dietary restriction. You add the deficient humor through foods or drinks that carry it. You cool what is too hot. You warm what is too cold. The treatments were rational. They followed logically from the theory. They were, in many cases, actively harmful, And yet the theory provided such a coherent explanatory framework that individual deaths could always be attributed to insufficient treatment, incorrect diagnosis of the imbalance, or the patient's constitution rather than any flaw in the system itself. This is a pattern that will recur throughout the history of medicine. A theory that explains everything explains nothing, because a theory that cannot be falsified cannot be corrected. The humoral system was, in a technical sense, unfalsifiable. If you bled a patient and they died, the answer was, you didn't bleed them enough, or you bled them at the wrong time, or their constitution was too weak to withstand the disease once the excess humor was released. The theory was never at fault. The theory was perfect. Only the application could fail. The tragedy is this. For roughly 1400 years, from Hippocrates to Vesalius, from Kos to Renaissance Florence, some version of this system governed Western medicine. Patients were bled, patients were purged, patients were given emetics and enemas and dietary regimens based on the logic of humoral balance. Some recovered, many didn't. And the question of how many people died across those 14 centuries because a system built on careful observation was also built on a fundamentally wrong theory of the body, that question is not one that has a comfortable answer.
Let me give you a specific case to hold on to. The year is 1799. The patient is 67 years old, has been out riding in cold, wet weather, and comes home with a severe sore throat that is rapidly obstructing his airway. He is famous, one of the most famous men in the Western world. His physicians are among the best available. They bleed him multiple times. In the space of 12 hours, they remove roughly 40% of his total blood volume. They also administer calomel, a mercury compound used as a laxative, along with tartar emetic to induce vomiting, and apply blistering agents to his throat and legs. The patient's name is George Washington. He dies. His death is almost certainly the direct result of his treatment. The bloodletting alone would have sent him into hypovolemic shock. The epiglottitis, or bacterial infection in his throat, might have killed him anyway. Antibiotics would not exist for another 140 years. But the treatment accelerated his death, and the physicians treating him were following the best medical practice of their era, rooted in a tradition that traced directly back to the Hippocratic corpus, administered with complete confidence in the best of intentions. This is the shadow side of Hippocrates, not malice, not ignorance in any simple sense, something more insidious. A framework so internally coherent, so intellectually satisfying, so thoroughly institutionalized that it became impossible to question from the inside. The great rational revolutionary gave medicine a system, and systems, once established, have a way of protecting themselves.
Let us go back to the oath, because even if you set aside the question of authorship, even if you accept that we cannot know with certainty who wrote it, the document itself is extraordinary and profoundly strange when you read it carefully. It begins, as I mentioned, with an invocation of the gods. This has always puzzled scholars who want the oath to represent a clean break from divine medicine. You cannot simultaneously reject divine causation and swear your professional commitment by Apollo and Asclepius. The oath itself is not internally consistent on this point, but it gets stranger. The oath includes this passage: "I will not use the knife, not even on sufferers from stone, but will withdraw in favor of such men as are engaged in this work." Translation: a physician swearing this oath is promising not to perform surgery, even to remove bladder stones, one of the most common and agonizing surgical procedures of antiquity. Why? One theory: the oath represents a specific school or sect within the broader Hippocratic tradition, possibly with Pythagorean influences, that had specific prohibitions. Surgery was considered a lower-class craft, associated with the barber surgeons and itinerant cutters who traveled from town to town performing procedures. Elite physicians didn't do surgery. They diagnosed, they prescribed, they counseled. The separation of medicine and surgery, which would persist in Europe for 1,500 years and cause enormous suffering, may be embedded in the oath itself. Then there is the passage about confidentiality. Whatever I see or hear in the lives of my patients, whether in connection with my professional practice or not, which ought not to be spoken of outside, I will keep secret, as considering all such things to be private. This is recognizably modern. This is the direct ancestor of medical confidentiality, of doctor-patient privilege, of HIPAA. The principle that what happens in the examination room stays in the examination room. It is here, in this document, in 400 BCE or thereabouts. And then the part that almost nobody talks about. I will not give a lethal drug to anyone if I am asked, nor will I advise such a plan. And similarly, I will not give a woman a pessary to cause an abortion. This is a prohibition on euthanasia and abortion, two of the most contested ethical issues in 21st century medicine, both explicitly addressed and both explicitly forbidden in the founding document of Western medical ethics. Except, they aren't forbidden in most modern versions of the oath. Almost every medical school in the Western world that still uses the Hippocratic Oath uses a modernized version. Some updated in the 1960s, some more recently. These versions typically remove the prohibitions on euthanasia and abortion, remove the invocation of the gods, sometimes remove the prohibition on surgery, and generally retain what feels modern while quietly discarding what doesn't. The irony is perfect. Medicine has been performing selective editing on the oath for centuries, deciding what Hippocrates really meant, what was culturally specific versus universally valid, in the same way that medicine has been performing selective reading on the corpus. We kept the parts that felt like us, we discarded the parts that didn't. Which raises the question, how much of Hippocrates is Hippocrates, and how much is a mirror that each era held up to see its own values reflected back in ancient authority?
The answer to that question, I think, is mostly mirror. Here is how the myth was built. After the Hippocratic corpus was collected in Alexandria, probably under the Ptolemies, who were voracious collectors of intellectual property, it sat, was copied, was commented on, was argued about. For several centuries, Hippocrates was famous, but not yet mythic. He was a great physician from Kos, founder of an important tradition. He was admired. He was not yet the father of medicine. That title came later. It came largely through a man who would have been horrified by how his own legacy was eventually handled. Galen of Pergamon. We'll get to Galen fully in the next episode. But here, the relevant fact is this. Galen, writing in Rome in the 2nd century CE, 5 or 6 centuries after Hippocrates, made Hippocrates the cornerstone of his own authority. He wrote commentaries on Hippocratic texts. He positioned himself as the true inheritor and interpreter of the Hippocratic tradition. He effectively created what we might call Hippocratism as a formal doctrine. And Galen's influence on Western medicine was so immense, so total, that it lasted until the Renaissance. Which means that for over a millennium, the way medicine understood Hippocrates was filtered through Galen. Hippocrates was whatever Galen said he was. When the Arab physicians of the Islamic Golden Age, Avicenna, Al-Razi, the tradition we'll explore in episode 6, translated and preserved and built upon Greek medicine, they preserved the Galenic Hippocratic synthesis. They made it more refined, more systematic, sometimes more accurate, but the framework remained humoral. The authority remained Hippocrates as interpreted by Galen. When the Renaissance humanists went looking for their medical origins, they found Hippocrates already positioned as the founding genius. The printing press spread his corpus across Europe. Medical schools built their curricula around him. The myth was now institutional. And here's the psychological mechanism that made it all possible and all necessary. Medicine is a profession built on authority. The patient in front of you is in pain, is frightened, is vulnerable. They need to believe that you know what you're doing. The physician needs to believe it too. And the easiest way to ground that authority is in a tradition, a lineage, that stretches back to the beginning of things. Every profession needs founding myths. Law has Justinian and Solon. Philosophy has Socrates. Religion has its prophets. Medicine needed Hippocrates. The myth wasn't a lie, exactly. It was a necessary story. A story that said, this tradition has always been rational, always been ethical, always been committed to the patient's welfare. Look, here is the oath. Here is the man who began it all, on an island in the Aegean, watching his patients breathe. The myth gave medicine its identity. The problem comes when the myth becomes so entrenched that it stops asking whether the identity is accurate. I do not want to leave you with the impression that the Hippocratic tradition was a monument to wrong thinking, because that would be equally false and considerably less interesting. Strip away the humoral theory, accept that the theoretical framework was incorrect, and look at what remains. Look at the clinical practice. What you find is genuinely astonishing. The Hippocratic physicians were exceptional observers, exceptional in a way that had no real parallel in the ancient world, outside perhaps the Egyptian surgical tradition. They watched their patients with an attention that was, by the standards of the age, almost scientific. The Epidemics, books 1 and 3 of the corpus, considered among the more reliably attributed texts, are case studies, not theoretical discussions, case studies, patient after patient, described with clinical precision. What the patient complained of, how the symptoms progressed, what happened on each day of the illness, whether the patient lived or died. It is reading these texts that you understand what was genuinely revolutionary about the tradition, not the theory, the practice of watching. One description in the Epidemics, and this is worth pausing on, describes what is now known as the Hippocratic facies, or Hippocratic face. It is the physical appearance of a patient approaching death, the nose sharp, the eyes sunken, the temples hollow, the ears cold with their lobes curled outward, the skin of the forehead dry and taut, the color of the whole face green or black or livid or lead-colored. This description is so precise, so accurate, so consistent with what modern physicians recognize in dying patients that it is still taught. It still has a name. 2,400 years later, medical students still learn to recognize the Hippocratic face as a sign of imminent death. That is not nothing. That is a remarkable act of observation, preserved across millennia, still clinically useful. The corpus also contains extraordinary passages on prognosis, the art of predicting the course of a disease. The Hippocratic physicians were, if anything, better at prognosis than at treatment, because prognosis required only observation and pattern recognition, not a correct causal theory. You didn't need to understand why a fever broke on the 7th day to know that fevers which broke on the 7th day tended to do better than those which didn't. The text on airs, waters, and places is effectively the first work of what we would now call environmental medicine and epidemiology. It argues, systematically, that the health of a population is shaped by its physical environment, the direction the city faces, the quality of the water, the seasonality of the winds, whether the land is marshy or elevated. This is not humorally derived nonsense. This is careful ecological thinking that anticipates modern public health theory by over 2,000 years. The corpus also contains the first serious discussion of what we would call clinical ethics. How should a physician behave at the bedside? How should information be communicated to patients? What is the physician's obligation when cure is impossible? These questions are asked and answered with a seriousness and sophistication that still resonates. Life is short and the art long, the occasion fleeting, experience fallible, and judgment difficult. That is the opening of the aphorisms, possibly the most famous sentence in the history of medicine, and one of the most honest. Not medicine will save you, not trust in the physician's power. The art is long. The occasion, the moment of acute illness, is fleeting. Experience is fallible. This is not the claim of a tradition that believes it has all the answers. This is the claim of a tradition that has spent serious time with patients who died and has learned something from the dying. Here is where we land. There is a marble bust that is probably in a museum near you or in a textbook on your shelf labeled Hippocrates. It shows a bearded, serene philosopher, the face of medicine itself. Here is what historians think about that bust. It almost certainly isn't him. The most famous image of Hippocrates, the one reproduced tens of thousands of times across Western culture, is believed by most classical scholars to actually be a bust of the Macedonian general Polyeuctus, or possibly of some unknown Hellenistic figure, which was misidentified centuries ago and has been misidentified ever since. We don't know what Hippocrates looked like. We may never know which text he wrote. We cannot be entirely certain, based on surviving primary sources, what he specifically taught. And yet, and this is the point, Medicine built one of its core institutions, the Hippocratic Oath, on his authority. Medical education for 2 millennia was organized around his corpus. The phrase Hippocratic medicine still means something, is still invoked, still matters in ethical and clinical debates. What does it mean when the foundation of a tradition is partly mythological? It means something important and perhaps uncomfortable, that traditions are not primarily about facts. They are about coherence, about shared identity, about the story a community tells itself about where it comes from and what it stands for. The Hippocratic tradition stood for something real, rational inquiry over superstition, systematic observation over divine attribution, the patient's welfare over the physician's convenience. These are real values. They have done real good, but they were attached to a name and a myth rather than left to stand on their own merits. And once you've done that, once you've anchored your values in a founding figure, you've also made those values hostage to the figure's authority. Which is why, for over 1,000 years, when someone tried to challenge humoral theory, tried to say, actually, blood is not one of 4 balanced fluids, but a complex biological substance with its own properties and functions, the first response was almost always, but Hippocrates, but the corpus, but the tradition. The myth protected the bad theory along with the good values. This is not unique to medicine. Every tradition does this. Religion, law, philosophy, physics, every intellectual tradition builds itself around founding figures and has to periodically go through the painful process of separating what those figures actually showed from what the tradition needs them to have shown. The difference with medicine is that the stakes are human life. When Ignaz Semmelweis in the 1840s tried to argue that doctors were killing patients by not washing their hands, the resistance he faced was partly institutional and partly ego, but it was also partly this. What he was saying implied that the ancient tradition had been doing it wrong, that Hippocrates, Galen, 2,000 years of accumulated authority had missed something a Hungarian obstetrician was now seeing in a Vienna maternity ward. The tradition could not accept that. Not immediately. It took decades and many deaths. Back on Kos, it is still afternoon. The olive trees are still there, descendants of the ones that stood in 400 BCE perhaps. The island is a tourist destination now. You can visit the Hippocrates tree, a massive plane tree in the main square of Kos town, under which, legend says, Hippocrates taught his students. The tree is approximately 500 years old. Hippocrates, if he existed as tradition describes him, died 2,000 years before that tree was planted. But the legend needed a tree. So, there is a tree. And the legend needed a face. So, we have a face. And the legend needed an oath. So, we have an oath. Modified, selectively edited, updated to reflect current ethics while retaining ancient authority, still administered to medical students who are entering a profession that, despite everything, has been trying for 2,500 years to do what the Hippocratic tradition at its best always asked. Watch carefully. Think clearly. Put the patient first. Not because Hippocrates said so, he may not have, but because someone on an island in the Aegean, sometime around 400 BCE, looked at a sick person and thought, there must be something rational going on here, something we can understand, something, if we pay close enough attention, we can learn. That thought, that impulse, that refusal to accept mystery as an answer, that is what the name carries. And that, whatever the man behind it actually looked like, turns out to have been worth keeping. The man lying on the stone floor has a sword wound that goes all the way through. Not a slash, not a graze. Through. You can see organs moving when he breathes. The year is roughly 158 CE. The city is Pergamon, in what is now Western Turkey. The arena smells of blood and sand and animal fat. And a young doctor, 28 years old, recently appointed physician to the gladiators, is kneeling over this man, making a decision. Everyone else in the room assumes the man is dead. Wounds like this are fatal. That is the consensus. That is what the books say. The young doctor does not care what the books say. He cleans the wound. He irrigates it. He reaches in, carefully, deliberately,
and repositions the protruding intestines. He closes the wound. He bandages it. He does this not because he has been taught to, but because he has watched. He has spent years watching bodies, animal and human, and he believes, based on direct observation, that a man with this wound can survive if the repair is done correctly. The gladiator lives. This is the first important thing to understand about Galen of Pergamon. He was not just a theorist. He was, by the standards of any era, a brilliant clinical practitioner. He saw things other doctors refused to see. He tested ideas other doctors refused to test. The second important thing to understand is this: he was also wrong about almost everything. And his wrongness, his beautiful, internally consistent, magnificently argued wrongness, would hold medicine hostage for 14 centuries. This is the story of how one man's genius became the world's most expensive intellectual prison.
Pergamon in the 2nd century CE is not a backwater. It is one of the great cities of the Roman Empire, a cultural capital, a seat of learning, a place where philosophy and medicine and architecture compete for attention the way social media companies do today. The city has a library that is the 2nd largest in the ancient world. It has a famous healing sanctuary, Asclepion, where people come from across the Mediterranean to be cured through dreams, baths, and the intercession of the god Asclepius. It has marble everywhere and ambition to match. Into this city, around 129 CE, Galen is born. His father is alias Nikon, an architect, mathematician, and farmer. By all accounts, a remarkable man, cultivated, curious, methodical. He gives his son the best education the ancient world can offer: grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics. Galen studies Plato, he studies Aristotle, he studies the Stoics. He learns how to argue, how to reason, how to construct a case so tightly that no one can find the seam. Then, when Galen is around 16, something happens that will redirect his life. His father has a dream. In the dream, the god Asclepius, god of medicine, divine healer, the deity whose serpent-wrapped staff is still the symbol of medicine today, appears to Nikon and tells him that his son must become a doctor. Now, you can interpret this however you want. Maybe Nikon genuinely believed in divine instruction. Maybe it was the kind of dream that, in retrospect, feels like permission to do what you already knew needed to happen. Maybe Galen himself told this story later, having understood that a founding myth is useful. What matters is what happened next. Nikon reoriented his son's education entirely. Galen began studying medicine with the intensity of someone who believes he has been chosen. And in Pergamon, medicine meant the Asclepion, the healing sanctuary, the place where patients slept on temple floors hoping the god would visit them in dreams and prescribe a cure. This sounds like superstition. It partly was, but the Asclepion was also, in practice, a surprisingly sophisticated therapeutic center. Patients received baths, exercise, dietary restrictions, herbal treatments, and psychological care. The priests who administered these treatments observed outcomes. They noticed what worked and what didn't. They kept records. Galen absorbed all of it. He read the existing medical literature obsessively, Hippocrates above all, whose texts were by then 4 centuries old and already reverential. He studied with multiple teachers across multiple cities. He went to Alexandria, which was still, even in the 2nd century, the center of medical learning in the Mediterranean world. In Alexandria, Galen encountered human bones. There were no intact human skeletons in Pergamon. The taboos against handling the dead were strong. But in Alexandria, skeletons from earlier generations of medical study were still available. He handled them. He memorized them. He began to form a picture of the human body from the inside. He also began to form a picture of himself. Because here is the other thing about Galen. He was, by every account including his own extensive autobiographical writings, intensely, almost pathologically confident. He believed he was the best physician alive. He said so, directly, repeatedly, in print. He believed that other doctors were incompetent frauds who were killing their patients through ignorance. He said that too. He wrote detailed, vicious attacks on rival physicians. He called them donkeys. He compared them unfavorably to cooks.
This arrogance was not baseless. He was, in fact, extraordinarily talented. But it would matter later. The confidence that made him a great diagnostician would also make him incapable of accepting that he might be wrong about anything fundamental. He returned to Pergamon in his late 20s. He needed a job. The best job available was the one nobody else wanted: physician to the gladiators. The gladiatorial games are not what most people imagine. They are not entirely about killing, not by the 2nd century CE. Gladiators are expensive investments. They require years of training, specialized diet, medical care. A dead gladiator is a financial loss. Promoters and arena owners want drama, not slaughter. Most gladiatorial bouts end with a wounded combatant surrendering, not dying. This means gladiators need doctors, very good doctors, doctors who can handle traumatic wounds, fractured bones, internal injuries, infections that develop in the days after combat. The gladiatorial physician is, functionally, what today we would call a trauma surgeon. Galen takes the job with an attitude that would become characteristic. He immediately considers himself better at it than anyone who had held it before. He's probably right. What Galen understands, what makes him exceptional in this role, is that the gladiatorial body is a text. Every wound is an opening. Every injury is a window into the machine of the human form. When a gladiator takes a blow and the flesh opens up, a physician standing in exactly the right place can see things that would otherwise be hidden: muscle layering, connective tissue, the relationship between organs, the way the body compensates when something goes wrong. Galen calls gladiatorial wounds windows into the body. He says this approvingly. He watches, he records, he treats, and his success rate is apparently remarkable. Later in life, he will boast that during his tenure as gladiatorial physician, he lost only 2 patients. Whether this is true or a characteristic exaggeration, the gladiators clearly recovered at a higher rate under his care than under previous physicians. And he learns. He learns more from those wounds than most doctors of his era will learn in a lifetime. But there is a limit. The limit is the human corpse. Roman law, Roman custom, Roman religion all prohibit the dissection of human bodies. You can study bones, you can observe wounds, you can watch what happens when the living body is opened by violence, but you cannot take a dead human and systematically cut it open to understand its architecture. This is the crack in the foundation of everything Galen will build, because Galen's knowledge of human internal anatomy comes primarily from animals: pigs, apes, goats, oxen. He dissects them extensively and brilliantly. He performs public dissections that are, by contemporary accounts, genuinely impressive as demonstrations of knowledge and technique. But pigs are not people. The internal architecture of a Barbary ape is close to human, but not identical. And when Galen extrapolates from animal to human, when he assumes that what he sees in the chest of an ape is identical to what lies in the chest of a man, he is sometimes right and sometimes catastrophically wrong. The catastrophic wrongs include the architecture of the heart and its valves, the structure of the liver, the path of blood through the body, the function of the kidneys, the anatomy of the uterus. He describes all of these based on animal anatomy. He describes them with extraordinary confidence. He publishes them in books that become the definitive texts of medicine for over 1,000 years. And most of it is wrong. The most consequential error, the one that will haunt medicine longer than almost any other, is his theory of blood. Galen believed that blood was continuously manufactured in the liver. He believed it was carried outward through the veins to nourish the body's tissues. He believed the blood was consumed by those tissues, used up like fuel, rather than circulated. He believed that the heart was not a pump, but a kind of hearth, warming blood and infusing it with pneuma, a vital spirit, before distributing it outward through the arteries. He believed there were tiny holes, pores, in the wall dividing the heart's 2 ventricles, through which blood seeped invisibly. No such pores exist. William Harvey will prove this wrong in 1628. For almost 1,500 years, medicine operates under a model of blood that is entirely, fundamentally incorrect. But the gladiators are healed, the wounds are closed, the patients survive. And Galen is 28 years old, brilliant and burning, and the greatest city in the world is waiting. Galen arrives in Rome around 162 CE. He is 33 years old. Rome in the 2nd century is not quite at its peak, but it is close. The empire stretches from Scotland to Mesopotamia. The city itself is home to 1 million people. It is dirty, crowded, violent, hierarchical, and intoxicating. For an ambitious man with something to prove, it is perfect. Galen comes armed with several things: genuine talent, extensive clinical experience, a combative personality, and an extraordinary gift for rhetoric. He gives lectures, public demonstrations. He performs dissections in front of audiences that include not just physicians, but philosophers, aristocrats, imperial officials. He is, by modern standards, a showman. But in the ancient world, this is not a pejorative. Rhetoric is a serious art. The ability to argue, to demonstrate, to hold an audience is a mark of genuine intellectual power. And Galen is exceptional at it. He demonstrates the nervous system by dissecting a living pig, controlling its squealing by cutting and releasing the nerve that governs the larynx. This stuns his audiences. He is the first to demonstrate, publicly and conclusively, that the brain controls the voice. The idea that Aristotle had promoted, that the heart is the seat of thought and sensation, takes a blow from which it will not recover. He demonstrates the function of the kidneys by tying off the ureters in a living animal, showing that urine backs up in the bladder. Simple, elegant, decisive. He wins the patronage of Marcus Aurelius, emperor and philosopher, the Stoic emperor who also wrote Meditations. Galen becomes physician to the imperial family. This is not just prestige, it is protection. In a city full of rival physicians and political intrigue, imperial favor is armor. He also makes enemies. Galen's method of conflict is direct, personal, and relentless. When he believes a colleague is wrong, he says so in public. When he believes a colleague is incompetent, he publishes a pamphlet explaining exactly why. He is insulted by other physicians and responds with escalation. He accuses rivals of practicing medicine they don't understand in pursuit of money. Some of this is fair. Roman medicine contains a great deal of dangerous charlatanism. Many of Galen's targets are legitimately bad doctors. But Galen's attacks are not proportional. They are not restrained. They are the attacks of a man who has decided that he alone understands medicine correctly and that everyone who disagrees is, at best, a fool.
This psychology is important. Understand it because it will explain what comes next. Galen is a man who has built his identity around being right. Not just correct on individual questions, but architecturally, systematically, fundamentally right about how the human body works. His entire sense of self is fused with his theoretical framework. What does it do to a mind when being wrong is existentially unacceptable? It makes that mind look for evidence that confirms rather than challenges. It makes that mind dismiss anomalies. It makes that mind build systems so elaborate and so internally consistent that they become beautiful objects, things you don't want to break even when you begin to suspect they are wrong. This is what Galen builds in Rome. He writes, prodigiously, relentlessly. He writes more than any physician before him and arguably more than any physician after him for centuries. At his most productive, he is dictating to scribes simultaneously. His output is estimated at over 2 million words that survive, and much has been lost. He writes on anatomy, on physiology, on pharmacology, on pathology, on hygiene, on diet, on pulse, on the soul, on the nature of disease, on the nature of the physician, on the nature of truth. And gradually, across this ocean of text, he constructs something unprecedented, a complete, unified theory of human medicine. The Galenic system is, if you can set aside the wrongness for a moment, one of the most impressive intellectual achievements of the ancient world. It takes the ideas of Hippocrates, the four humors, the concept of balance and imbalance, the relationship between constitution and disease, and massively expands them into a complete explanatory framework for everything the human body does.
Here is the architecture. At the foundation, the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Every person has all four, in proportions that determine their temperament and their health. A sanguine person has abundant blood, optimistic, energetic. A phlegmatic person has excess phlegm, calm, perhaps sluggish. A choleric person has too much yellow bile, hot-tempered. A melancholic person has too much black bile, prone to sadness and introspection. Disease in this framework is imbalance, too much of one humor, or the wrong humor in the wrong place, or the right humor in a corrupted state. Treatment is restoration of balance through diet, exercise, and, when necessary, through intervention. Bleeding to reduce blood, purging to remove bile. This is not entirely without logic. Inflammation does look like excess heat. Depression does have correlates in what we'd now call neurochemistry. The idea that constitution influences health is correct, even if the mechanism Galen proposed is entirely wrong. But Galen goes further, much further. He adds pneuma, a vital spirit that comes in three forms: natural pneuma, made in the liver and carried through the veins; vital pneuma, refined in the heart and carried through the arteries; psychic pneuma, perfected in the brain and distributed through the nerves. This gives medicine a spiritual dimension. The body is not just blood and flesh. It is animated by an invisible, hierarchical force. Illness is not just chemical imbalance. It is a disruption of the life force itself. For a civilization that does not yet have microscopes, chemistry, or any understanding of cell biology, this is actually a reasonable attempt to explain life. How does a body move? What makes it more than meat? Pneuma is Galen's answer to the hard problem of animation, the ancient equivalent of asking why some matter is alive and some is not. Then he adds the three souls. Following Plato, Galen divides the soul into three parts, each housed in a different organ. The rational soul lives in the brain. The spirited soul, emotions, passion, courage, lives in the heart. The appetitive soul, desire, reproduction, digestion, lives in the liver. This is why, in the ancient world, people who fall in love say they feel it in their liver. This is not metaphor. This is anatomy. The system goes further still. Galen develops an elaborate theory of pulse, different qualities of pulse corresponding to different disease states, different temperaments, different balances of humor. He writes 16 separate books on the pulse. 16. He describes the pulse the way a composer might describe music, with rhythms, characters, subtleties that require years of study to distinguish. He develops a pharmacological system that catalogs hundreds of plant, animal, and mineral substances and classifies them according to their qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry, in 4 degrees of intensity. Treatment means matching the quality of the drug to the imbalance of the patient. And all of this, all of it, coheres. It hangs together. Each part supports the others. The humors explain constitution. The pneuma explains function. The pulse theory provides diagnostic access. The pharmacological system provides therapeutic response. It is elegant. It is complete. It provides an answer for everything. That is its genius, and that is its danger. Because a system that explains everything cannot be falsified by observation alone. Whatever the patient does, gets better, gets worse, dies, can be explained by the framework. The patient recovered because the humors were rebalanced. The patient worsened because the intervention was too little or too late. The patient died because the constitution was too fundamentally disrupted. There is always an explanation. There is never a result that simply says, the framework is wrong. This is not a flaw in Galen specifically. It is a flaw in grand unified theories everywhere, in every era, including ours. But here is the thing that makes Galen genuinely complicated rather than simply wrong. Some of it was right.
The nerve experiments. Galen is the first person to systematically demonstrate the relationship between specific nerves and specific functions. He performs careful dissections and experimental ligations, cutting or tying off nerves at different points, and observes the consequences. He demonstrates that severing the spinal cord at different levels
produces different kinds of paralysis. He identifies the function of the recurrent laryngeal nerve, the nerve that controls the voice. He correctly identifies that sensation and motion are controlled by different neural pathways. This is not trivial. This is observational neuroscience 1,500 years before the word neuroscience exists. His work on the pulse is, within its framework, clinically sophisticated. He describes dozens of pulse variants and correlates them with disease states. Some of these correlations are real, the relationship between pulse character and cardiac or respiratory disease, for example. He has no way to understand why they correlate in the terms we would use today, but the observations themselves are often accurate. His pharmacological work is substantial. He catalogs and classifies hundreds of medicinal substances and describes their clinical effects. Many of these descriptions are accurate. Many of the plant substances he recommends, willow bark for example, which contains salicylate, the precursor to aspirin, are genuinely effective. He didn't understand the mechanism, but the clinical observation was correct. He identifies the connection between diet and health with a sophistication that goes beyond most of what follows him until the 20th century. He understands that different bodies require different diets. He understands that age and activity level and climate all affect nutritional needs. He advocates for exercise as medicine with a specificity unusual for his era. He performs, and describes in detail, surgical procedures for wounds, fractures, and organ injuries that are clinically competent by any standard. His attention to prognosis, to predicting how a disease will progress based on observed symptoms, is exceptionally careful. He understands that medicine is not just diagnosis and treatment, but prediction. What will happen and when and why. His approach to prognosis influenced medical thinking for centuries after his death, and some of his prognostic observations remain valid. And perhaps most importantly, Galen insisted, consistently and forcefully, that medicine must be grounded in observation, not just in received wisdom, not just in philosophical speculation, in direct, empirical observation of the body. The great irony of Galen's legacy is that the principle he championed, look at the body, trust what you see, let observation trump authority, was precisely the principle that, when applied to his own work, eventually destroyed it. Vesalius looked, Harvey looked. They trusted what they saw, and what they saw did not match what Galen had written. Galen would, theoretically, have approved of their method. He just would have been furious at their conclusions. Galen dies around 216 CE. He is in his late 80s, an extraordinary lifespan for the ancient world, which he attributed, typically, to his own excellent medical regimen. For roughly a century after his death, his work exists alongside other medical traditions. It is influential but not yet dominant. Other voices compete. Then the Roman world begins to change. The empire fractures. Learning concentrates. Institutions, religious and political, begin to exert greater control over what is known and how it is known. In the Christian West, medical education narrows. In the Byzantine East, Galen's works are preserved and codified into authoritative compilations. In the Islamic world, which inherits Greek learning and massively amplifies it, Galen is translated into Arabic, commentated upon, and elevated to a status approaching scripture. Ibn Sina, Avicenna, builds his canon of medicine largely on a Galenic foundation. The canon becomes the standard medical textbook in both the Islamic world and eventually the Western universities of the Middle Ages. And in the medieval Western university, something important happens to Galen's work. It becomes doctrine. Not just highly regarded, not just influential, doctrine. To question Galen is, in the intellectual climate of medieval medicine, to question accumulated authority itself. Medical education consists largely of reading and commenting on Galenic texts. Clinical observation is secondary. Theoretical mastery is primary. There's a specific, famous story that illustrates this better than any abstract argument. In the 16th century, an anatomist is performing a public dissection, the kind of theatrical event that was part of university medical education. He is demonstrating Galen's anatomy from the text, while a barber surgeon does the actual cutting. The dissected human body does not match Galen's description. The anatomist's response? He says the human body must have changed since Galen's time. The human body changed since the 2nd century. This is what 1,400 years of authority does to the capacity for direct observation. It inverts the hierarchy of evidence. The text becomes more real than the body in front of you. This is the intellectual prison. And then, slowly, painfully, over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, someone starts picking the lock. Andreas Vesalius, a Fleming working in Padua, publishes De Humani Corporis Fabrica in 1543. He has dissected human bodies himself, obtained at great personal risk and ethical compromise. He has looked at what is actually there without the filter of Galenic expectation. What he finds does not match. The septum of the heart has no pores, no invisible passages. The architecture of the bones is different from what Galen described. The uterus does not look like a pig's uterus. The liver does not have the 5 lobes Galen attributed to it. Vesalius does not entirely abandon Galen. The process is too psychologically difficult, the authority too great. But he begins to say, in print, that Galen was wrong about specific, verifiable things. The reaction is ferocious. Jacobus Silvius, one of the greatest anatomists of the generation before Vesalius, a man who had dedicated his life to Galenic medicine, publishes a response calling Vesalius a madman and a calumniator of the divine Galen. His argument is the one we have already met. If Galen said the body looks a certain way, and the body does not look that way, the body must have changed. This is what a mind looks like when it cannot afford to be wrong. William Harvey publishes De Motu Cordis in 1628. He demonstrates, through a combination of anatomical observation and quantitative reasoning, the kind of bathtub arithmetic of how much blood the heart must pump, that blood circulates. That it is not manufactured and consumed, but driven by the heart in a continuous loop. That Galen's model of blood is entirely, foundationally incorrect. The response, again, is fierce. Harvey's practice suffers. Patients leave him. He is accused of madness. A colleague writes, in apparently sincere puzzlement, that Harvey can be heard stating his position, but no one takes him seriously among men over 40. No one over 40. Because by 40, you have spent your entire career inside the Galenic system. It is not just a framework, it is the architecture of your professional identity. To demolish it is to demolish yourself. And this is the deepest lesson in Galen's story. Not the specific anatomical errors, not the wrong theory of blood, but the broader phenomenon that his story represents. What happens when knowledge becomes identity? When a framework becomes not just a tool for understanding, but a definition of what it means to be a doctor, a scholar, a person of learning. The framework stops being a map. It becomes a homeland. And you don't revise your homeland, you defend it. Galen left Pergamon, that city of columns and healing and his father's dream, and went out into the world and changed it. He changed it more thoroughly, more durably, more pervasively than almost any individual in the history of medicine. He was wrong about blood. He was wrong about the heart. He was wrong about the liver and the uterus and the septum and the path of air through the body. He was wrong about things he had never seen, confident in his extrapolations from animals he had cut open on stone tables in a city he left behind. He was also right about nerves, right about pulse, right about drugs, right about observation as the foundation of medical knowledge, right about the relationship between diet, exercise, and health, right about prognosis, right about the intelligence of the living body and the physician's duty to understand it from the inside. He was brilliant and wrong and right all at once, in proportions that no clean moral separates. And then his ideas, the right ones tangled together with the wrong ones, became the answer, became the thing that could not be questioned, the authority that ended other arguments, the text that made bodies unreliable witnesses against themselves.
for 1,400 years. Stand in a medieval medical school and watch a professor describe the pores in the heart that have no pores. Watch a physician bleed a patient who does not need bleeding because the humors must be balanced. Watch a patient die of infection while the physician washes his hands in theory rather than water. And understand that this is not stupidity. These are often the smartest people in their societies, well-read, logically rigorous, intellectually serious. They are doing exactly what their training has taught them to do. They are reasoning carefully from their premises. Their premises are wrong, and they have no mechanism for discovering this because the thing that would correct them, direct observation over authority, was the thing that the authority of Galen had taught them to distrust. A system that perfectly explains everything is always the most dangerous kind. It offers the deep comfort of completeness. It has an answer for every objection. It requires no additions, no revisions, no humility. That comfort is precisely the thing you should distrust. Science, real science, the kind Galen himself claimed to practice, has a different relationship with wrongness. It does not treat wrong ideas as failures of intelligence or character. It treats them as information. Data about the edges of current understanding. Invitations to look more carefully. Galen looked at living bodies with more care than almost anyone before him. He saw things no one had seen. He wrote them down with such force and clarity and confidence that they became, for over a millennium, the last word on what a body was. He would have hated this. He would have hated being the last word. He would have hated a world in which students copied his texts instead of dissecting bodies. He wrote explicitly that a good doctor must observe for himself and not simply trust the words of his predecessors. He just never applied that principle to his own predecessors, or to himself. The most dangerous errors are not made by people who are careless. They are made by people who are brilliant and certain. Galen was both. His ghost still walks through medicine, not in the four humors, those are gone mostly, but in the psychological pattern he represents. In every generation of physicians who treated anomalies as exceptions rather than refutations. In every researcher who shaped their data to fit their theory. In every expert whose expertise became their prison. We still do this. We do it in medicine. We do it in economics, in psychology, in physics, in every field where a beautiful, internally consistent framework has been assembled by minds powerful enough to make it seem complete. The question Galen forces on every practitioner of anything is this: what is your septum? What is the wall in your framework through which invisible pores are passing evidence you refuse to see? The answer is probably not written in any of your books. You'll need to open something up.
The patient is sitting upright. He is in a courtyard somewhere in the Ganges Plain, in the kingdom of Kashi, in what we would call northern India. The year is approximately 600 BCE. Around him, the air smells of turmeric and clarified butter, and something sharper, an antiseptic solution made from sesame oil and bark. The surgeon examines his face. The nose has been destroyed, amputated as a punishment, a common practice in this era, one of the crueler currencies of power. The surgeon has seen this before. He has a method. He takes a leaf, a peepal leaf, the sacred fig, and holds it against the cheek. He traces its outline. He cuts along the traced lines, carefully, lifting a flap of skin from the cheek while leaving one edge attached. He folds it upward, over the wound where the nose was. He inserts 2 small tubes of wood into the nostrils to maintain their shape as the tissue heals. He stitches the edges closed. He powders the wound with licorice and red sandalwood and barberry. Then he waits. The skin takes. The nose heals. The tubes are removed. The patient goes home with a face. This procedure, rhinoplasty, the surgical reconstruction of the nose, will not appear in European medical literature for another 2,000 years. When Italian surgeons begin performing it in the 1400s, they will be celebrated as innovators. When British surgeons encounter it being performed in India in the 1790s and publish a description in a London medical journal, they will marvel at the technique as though discovering something new. It was not new. It was ancient.
and it was only one of hundreds of procedures described in a text that most of the world has never heard of. There is a version of the history of medicine that goes like this. The ancient Greeks invented rational medicine, the Romans spread it, the Middle Ages nearly lost it, and then the Renaissance and the Scientific Revolution rebuilt it into the system we know today. Every hospital, every medical school, every textbook traces itself back to Hippocrates and Galen, to the universities of Bologna and Padua, to Harvey and Vesalius and Pasteur. That story is true. It is also catastrophically incomplete. Because while Hippocrates was teaching on the Greek island of Kos, while Galen was performing dissections in Pergamon, there were other doctors in other parts of the world who had already gone further, who had built systems of medical knowledge that were, in crucial respects, more sophisticated than anything Europe would produce for 1,000 years after them. They worked in the river valleys of the Indian subcontinent and along the Yellow River in China. They wrote their findings down. They trained students. Their knowledge was copied, transmitted, translated, preserved. And then, through a combination of geography, politics, colonial violence, and sheer intellectual arrogance, it was set aside. This is the story of what they knew, what they built, and what the world lost when it chose not to listen. To understand Indian medicine, you have to understand what it was trying to do. The oldest Indian medical knowledge is embedded in the Vedas, the ancient Sanskrit texts that form the foundation of Hindu thought, composed between roughly 1500 and 1000 BCE. The Atharva Veda, the fourth Veda, contains the earliest systematic descriptions of disease and healing, incantations against fever, against parasites, against madness, prayers to plants with medicinal properties, descriptions of the body that are part magical, part anatomical, entirely serious in their attempt to understand what human health actually is. This is not superstition as dismissal. This is the earliest form of a question that medicine has never stopped asking. What is the relationship between the body and the forces, seen and unseen, that act upon it? By approximately 600 BCE, Indian medicine had developed into a formal system called Ayurveda, a Sanskrit compound meaning roughly the knowledge of life. And Ayurveda rested on a theory of the body that, in its own idiom, was as rigorous as anything the Greeks would produce. The theory centered on three forces, called doshas, that governed the body's functioning. Vata, associated with movement and the nervous system, Pitta, associated with transformation, digestion, and metabolism, Kapha, associated with structure, stability, and fluid balance. Every person had a unique constitution, a particular ratio of these three forces that defined their natural state of health. Disease in this framework was not invasion from outside, but imbalance within. The goal of medicine was restoration, bringing the doshas back into their proper proportion. Now, this is not modern biochemistry, but here is what it is. It is a systemic theory of health, one that asks not just what is wrong, but what is the underlying pattern that is broken down. It is a model that insists on individual variation, that recognizes that different people respond differently to the same illness, the same treatment. It is a framework that integrates diet, sleep, emotional state, and seasonal change into its understanding of health. In 600 BCE, the Greeks were still mostly attributing disease to divine displeasure. The Ayurvedic physicians were asking, what is the patient's constitution? What has changed in their diet? What season are we in? This is not a primitive approach. It is a different approach, one that has been confirmed in fragmented ways by modern personalized medicine, by psychoneuroimmunology, by the growing recognition that treating disease requires treating the whole person. And it is the philosophical foundation on which one of the most astonishing medical texts ever written would be built. His name was Sushruta. We don't know exactly when he lived, somewhere between the 6th and 3rd centuries BCE almost certainly. We don't know what he looked like. We have no portrait, no coin bearing his image, no tomb. What we have is his book. The Sushruta Samhita is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of human knowledge. It is a treatise on surgery, comprehensive, systematic, and, in its core insights, shockingly modern. It describes the human body with a detail and accuracy that Western medicine would not match until the Renaissance. and it describes surgical procedures that would not appear in European medicine until the 18th and 19th centuries. Let the numbers speak first. The Sushruta Samhita describes more than 300 distinct surgical procedures. It catalogs 120 surgical instruments, including scalpels, scissors, forceps, specula, probes, and syringes, many of which bear a striking resemblance to instruments still in use today. It classifies wounds into 6 types. It describes the properties of 700 medicinal plants. It includes detailed instructions for surgical training. Sushruta recommended that students practice incision on watermelons, probing on hollow bamboo reeds, and suturing on leather pads before ever approaching a human body. But numbers alone don't capture what Sushruta understood. He understood anatomy, not Galenic anatomy, built from animal dissection and assumption, actual human anatomy, derived from careful, systematic observation of the human body. He described the skeleton with extraordinary accuracy. He identified different types of tissue: fat, muscle, nerve, bone. He understood that the body had both structure and process, that the organs were not inert containers but active systems. He understood infection, not in the bacterial sense, but in the functional sense. He knew that wounds needed to be cleaned. He knew that certain substances, sesame oil, honey, clarified butter, had properties that prevented wounds from turning bad. Modern analysis has confirmed that several of these substances have genuine antimicrobial activity. Sushruta didn't know about bacteria, but he had observed empirically that certain preparations kept wounds clean while others did not, and he built his practice on that observation. He performed rhinoplasty, as we saw in that courtyard at the beginning of this episode. He performed otoplasty, reconstruction of the ear. He described cataract surgery using a technique called couching that involved using a curved needle to displace the opaque lens of the eye, allowing light to enter. He described procedures for urinary tract obstructions. He described the removal of foreign bodies from the throat. He described fracture management, including traction and splinting techniques that align with modern orthopedic principles. He described what we now recognize as a cesarean section, a procedure for delivering an infant when the mother has died in labor to attempt to save the child. He described, in one of the most striking passages in the entire text, a procedure for intestinal anastomosis, joining 2 sections of bowel after removing a damaged segment. This procedure was not performed in Europe until the late 19th century. And woven through all of this technical instruction is a philosophy of surgery that sounds, in its essential spirit, entirely contemporary. Sushruta believed that a surgeon needed both technical skill and compassion. He wrote that the physician who lacks compassion is like a bird without wings, capable of the form of medicine, but not its substance. He wrote about the psychological state of the patient, about the importance of preparing the patient mentally as well as physically. He was, in the most meaningful sense of the word, a scientist, someone who based his practice on observation, who trained his students systematically, who wrote down what he found so that others could build on it. And then his knowledge traveled.
The Sushruta Samhita was translated into Arabic in the 8th century, during the height of the Islamic Golden Age, when scholars in Baghdad were systematically translating the great knowledge traditions of the ancient world. Arab physicians read Sushruta. They incorporated his techniques. Some of his surgical insights passed, through Arabic texts, into medieval European medicine, though often without attribution, without acknowledgement, without anyone in Europe knowing where these ideas had originated. And then the Arabic translations stopped circulating in Europe. Latin scholars focused on Galen and Avicenna. Sushruta's name disappeared from European medical discourse for centuries. In India, under the weight of Mughal rule and then British colonialism, Ayurvedic practice was increasingly marginalized. In the 1830s, British colonial administrators began a systematic policy of replacing traditional Indian medicine with European medicine in Indian institutions. Medical schools in Calcutta and Bombay taught Galen and Harvey, not Sushruta and Charaka. The ancient texts were dismissed as folklore. A system that had been developing for over 2,000 years was, in the space of a few decades, officially written off. The wound that left, in Indian medical culture, in the history of global medicine, has never fully closed.
8,000 miles from the Ganges Plain, another civilization was asking the same questions.
The Yellow Emperor's classic of medicine, Huangdi Neijing, is the foundational text of Chinese medicine. Attributed by tradition to the legendary Emperor Huangdi, it was almost certainly compiled by multiple authors over several centuries, reaching its current form around 300 BCE, though it incorporates knowledge that is older still. It is not a medical manual in the Western sense. It is not a list of diseases and treatments, a catalog of drugs, a set of surgical procedures. It is something more fundamental and more strange, a theory of what the body is. The Neijing presents the human body as a microcosm, a smaller version of the larger world, governed by the same forces that govern nature. The fundamental concept is qi, often translated as vital energy or life force, though neither translation fully captures what the text means. Qi is not a mystical substance. In the Neijing's framework, qi is the animating principle of all processes. It is what makes metabolism, metabolism, what makes circulation, circulation, what makes thought, thought. When qi flows freely, the body is healthy. When qi is blocked, depleted, or misdirected, disease follows. Qi flows through the body along channels, called meridians, that connect the organs, the surface of the body, and the extremities in a complex, interconnected network. There are 12 primary meridians, each associated with a particular organ system. There are hundreds of specific points along these meridians where the flow of qi can be influenced from outside the body. This is the theoretical foundation of acupuncture, and it is where Western medicine, historically, has dismissed Chinese medicine most readily, because there is no anatomical structure that corresponds to the meridian system. You cannot cut open a body and find a meridian. The channels don't exist in the way that arteries and nerves exist. But before that dismissal settles, it is worth pausing on what the Neijing got empirically right. The Neijing physicians developed a diagnostic method built around pulse reading, palpating the radial pulse at the wrist at multiple positions, with multiple degrees of pressure, to assess the state of different organ systems. They distinguished at least 28 different pulse qualities. They were using the pulse to diagnose internal states 1,500 years before William Harvey explained what the pulse actually was. The Neijing describes the circulation of blood and qi through the body, not with Harvey's mechanical precision, but with a recognition that something moves continuously through the body in a closed circuit. The text contains this line: "The blood current flows continuously in a circle and never stops." It was written around 300 BCE. Harvey made the Western medical world accept this idea in 1628. The Neijing understood that emotional states affect physical health, that grief, anger, fear, and worry had specific physiological effects on specific organs, that chronic stress was a cause of illness. Modern psychoneuroimmunology has confirmed the mechanisms of this. The Neijing physicians had no mechanisms, but they had the observation, which is where all medicine begins. They understood that different seasons require different dietary and behavioral adjustments, that the liver behaves differently in spring than in autumn, that the kidneys are more vulnerable in winter. Modern chronobiology has confirmed that circadian and seasonal rhythms affect organ function in ways that are only now being mapped. These were not mystical insights. They were clinical observations, made over centuries of careful attention to patients, codified into a theory that, like all theories, was partly right and partly wrong, but was trying, seriously and systematically, to answer the same question Sushruta was asking: what is a healthy body, and how do you restore it when it breaks?
Let us talk about acupuncture directly. Because it is the element of Chinese medicine that has attracted the most derision from Western scientists, and the most credulous overclaiming from its proponents, and the most confused evidence from actual clinical research, and it deserves a clearer account than it usually receives. The practice of inserting fine needles into specific points on the body to treat illness is described in the Neijing and in later texts with extraordinary specificity. There are 365 classical acupuncture points, later expanded to over 2,000 in various traditions. Each point has specific indications, conditions for which stimulating that point is believed to be therapeutic. The relationship between points and conditions is not random. It follows the logic of the meridian system, of organ relationships, of the body conceived as an interconnected whole. What has modern research confirmed?
Acupuncture produces measurable neurological effects. Stimulation of acupuncture points activates specific pathways in the nervous system, triggers the release of endorphins and other neuropeptides, modulates the activity of the autonomic nervous system, and produces changes in brain activity that can be measured by fMRI. These are not placebo effects, or rather, they are not only placebo effects. There is a physiological response to needle insertion at these specific points that is distinct from needle insertion elsewhere. Clinical trials have shown acupuncture to be more effective than no treatment or sham treatment for several specific conditions, particularly chronic pain, including lower back pain, neck pain, osteoarthritis, and headache. The World Health Organization, as of its 2003 review, recognized acupuncture as having demonstrated effectiveness for over 24 conditions. What research has not confirmed is the classical theoretical framework, the meridians, the qi, the organ relationships of the Neijing. You cannot needle the kidney meridian and expect it to affect the physical kidney in any straightforward way. The mechanisms of acupuncture's effects, to the extent they have been mapped, run through the nervous system and the brain, not through the classical channels. This is not a contradiction that should surprise us. The classical framework was a model, the best model available with 300 BCE technology to explain observed clinical effects. The model was wrong in its details. The observations it was built on were real. This is, incidentally, the same situation we find with humoral theory. Galen's theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, is completely wrong as a biochemical description of the body. But the clinical observations it was built on, that fever is associated with inflammation, that depression is associated with something different from mania, that diet affects health, were real. The model was wrong. The observations survived. Chinese medicine made a similar bargain, and it has paid the price of that bargain. Because the theoretical framework is wrong, the entire system gets dismissed, including the observations that are right. Now, Li Shizhen. Born in 1518 in Hubei province, Li Shizhen spent 27 years, from age 35 to age 61, writing the most comprehensive pharmacopoeia in the history of medicine. The Ben Chao Gong Mu, the Compendium of Materia Medica, was published in 1596, 5 years after his death. It contains descriptions of 1,892 medicinal substances, including 1,094 plants, 444 animal substances, and 275 minerals. It describes 11,096 prescriptions. To put that in context, John Gerard's Herbal, published in England in 1597, 1 year after the Ben Chao, described approximately 1,800 plants, and was considered the most comprehensive botanical work in European history. Li Shizhen's work was an order of magnitude larger, more systematic, more rigorously tested. He personally tasted many of the substances he described to verify their properties. He cross-referenced earlier texts and noted where they contradicted each other. He classified substances by their properties rather than their traditional categories, anticipating the systematic approach to classification that would not appear in Western botany until Linnaeus, 150 years later. The Ben Chao Gong Mu was translated into Japanese in the 17th century, into Latin in the 18th century. European botanists and natural historians read it and cited it. Darwin referenced it in The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication. And yet Li Shizhen does not appear in Western medical history as a founding figure. His name is not in the standard medical school curriculum. His work is not cited alongside Vesalius and Harvey as foundational to the modern understanding of medicine.
This is not because his contribution was smaller. It is because it arrived from the wrong direction, from China, written in a medical framework that Western medicine had categorized as other, as Eastern, as traditional rather than scientific. The politics of knowledge. The geography of authority. These are not scientific problems, but they have shaped what medicine knows and what medicine ignores as surely as any experiment.
So why did the world choose a different path? This is the question that sits at the center of this episode, and it does not have a simple answer. It has several answers, braided together in ways that are difficult to separate cleanly. The first answer is geography.
India and China were, in the ancient and medieval world, distant from the centers of Western intellectual exchange. Greek knowledge spread through Alexander's conquests, through Rome, through the trade routes of the Mediterranean world. Indian and Chinese knowledge spread through their own trade networks. The Silk Road carried goods and ideas in both directions, and Chinese and Indian medical knowledge did travel, did reach the Islamic world, did influence Arab physicians who were among the most sophisticated in the medieval world. But the translation movement of the Islamic Golden Age, which preserved and extended Greek and Roman medical knowledge, did not give Indian and Chinese medicine the same treatment. Sushruta was translated, partially. Ayurvedic text influenced Avicenna, but the transmission was selective, filtered, partial. And when the Islamic world's intellectual momentum slowed, what passed to Europe was mostly the Greek tradition, amplified. The second answer is the scientific revolution. Beginning in the 17th century, European medicine began transforming itself through systematic experimentation, through anatomy, through chemistry, through the germ theory of disease. This was genuinely revolutionary, and it produced a framework so powerful, so successful, so capable of explaining phenomena that had been mysterious for millennia, that everything it could not immediately account for began to look, by contrast, like superstition. The meridian system could not be found anatomically. The doshas could not be measured chemically. Qi could not be isolated in a laboratory. In the framework of 19th century reductionist science, this meant these things didn't exist, and by extension, the medical systems built around them were invalid. This was not entirely wrong. The theoretical frameworks were wrong, or at least incomplete, but the dismissal of the entire tradition, the surgical knowledge, the pharmacological knowledge, the clinical observations, that was a mistake, a costly one. The third answer is colonialism, and this one is the most direct. When the British colonized India, they did not just extract resources, they restructured institutions. They made English the language of education. They replaced Indian medical schools with European ones. They explicitly and deliberately marginalized Ayurvedic practice, not because it had been scientifically tested and found wanting, but because it was Indian, and they were building an empire that required the cultural subordination of the colonized. A formal proclamation by the Council of India in 1835, drafted by Thomas Macaulay, a man who freely admitted he had never studied Indian science, declared that all of Indian literature and philosophy was worth less than a single shelf of European books. Ayurvedic training was cut from the curriculum of Indian medical institutions. Practitioners were denied the same legal standing as European-trained doctors. This was not a scientific judgment. It was a political one. And it worked. By the time Indian independence arrived in 1947, Ayurvedic medicine had been so thoroughly marginalized within the official medical establishment that restoring its credibility, even just restoring access to its historical texts, required deliberate effort. Chinese medicine faced a different but parallel fate. The Opium Wars, the political humiliations of the 19th century, the forced opening of Chinese ports to Western trade, these came with Western medical missions, Western-run hospitals, Western medical schools. The Chinese government, in the early 20th century, debated whether to abolish traditional Chinese medicine entirely, not because it had failed, but because Western medicine was the medicine of modernity, and modernity was what China desperately needed to survive. Traditional Chinese medicine survived. It was not abolished, but it survived in a subordinate position, studied in parallel with Western medicine, but always treated as secondary to it, the folk tradition rather than the science. And then, in 1972, a Chinese scientist named Tu Youyou opened a 2,000-year-old text. She was part of a secret military project, codenamed Project 523, commissioned by Mao Zedong, tasked with finding a treatment for malaria that was devastating Chinese and North Vietnamese troops. The disease had been treated with chloroquine, but resistance had developed. The existing pharmacological toolkit had nothing new to offer. Tu Youyou turned to the ancient Chinese medical literature. She and her team systematically reviewed over 2,000 traditional prescriptions, looking for anything that historical practitioners had used to treat fever and the symptoms consistent with malaria. In the Handbook of Prescriptions for Emergency Treatment, written by a physician named Ge Hong in the 4th century CE, she found a reference to sweet wormwood, Artemisia annua, and a specific preparation method that differed from how the plant had been used in previous research. Ge Hong had written, Take a handful of sweet wormwood, soak it in 2 liters of water, wring it out, take the juice, and drink it all. The key word was soak, not boil. 2UU realized that previous extraction methods had used heat, which was destroying the active compound. She developed a low-temperature extraction process. She tested it. It worked with extraordinary effectiveness against malarial parasites. The compound was artemisinin. It became the foundation of combination therapies that have saved an estimated hundreds of millions of lives since the 1980s. In 2015, 2UU was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. The treatment she found was hidden in a 1,700-year-old Chinese text. There is a story about Sushruta in the Sushruta Samhita, a framing story, the kind of device ancient texts often use to establish their own authority. Sushruta, the story goes, was a student. He learned from a master named Dhanvantari, the divine physician, the god of Ayurvedic medicine, who had himself learned from the gods. The knowledge comes down through generations. Each physician receives it from someone before them, adds to it, and passes it on. This is a myth, but it is also a description of something real, the way medical knowledge actually works. No one invents it from nothing. Every discovery is built on a foundation of observation laid down by people who came before. Every surgical technique begins with someone who tried, failed, adjusted, and tried again. Every drug begins with a plant that someone noticed had a particular effect. The history of medicine is not a single river. It is a delta, dozens of channels, some wider than others, some connecting and diverging and reconnecting, some going underground for centuries before emerging again somewhere else. India and China developed channels of extraordinary depth and width. They mapped territories that Western medicine didn't reach until centuries later. Their cartography was in a different language, using different concepts, grounded in different philosophical frameworks, but they were mapping the same body, the same diseases, the same human hope that illness can be understood and overcome. The tragedy is not that their frameworks were imperfect. All frameworks are imperfect. The tragedy is that the imperfection of the framework was used to dismiss the accuracy of the observation. That Western medicine, in its moment of greatest confidence, concluded that it had found the one true method, and everything else was superstition. It hadn't. It never does. No tradition ever will. Because the body is more complex than any model. And the history of medicine is the history of getting less wrong, slowly, painfully, generation by generation. 2,500 years ago, in a courtyard in the Ganges Plain, a surgeon reconstructed a human nose from a flap of living skin, using techniques that would not appear in Europe for 2 millennia. He didn't do it because a god told him to. He did it because he had seen it work, because a teacher had shown him, and that teacher had been shown by someone else. And somewhere at the beginning of that chain was a person who had simply tried, and watched, and written down what they saw. The river is still running. We are still learning to drink from it.